Chapter 595. Grandmasters were called grandmasters because they had to experience countless battles to deeply understand the details of the flow of primal energies of the universe. Only then could they break through from Realm 6 to Realm 7 and move mountains. Zhang Guangdao was the least attention-grabbing of these grandmasters. But at this time, his slight abnormalities were immediately detected by the surrounding grandmasters. Wei Wujiu turned his head and narrowed his eyes. He saw a copper box appear in Zhang Guangdao's hand. At the bottom of this copper box was a silver-white crystal. Inside the copper box, there were dozens of extremely thin silver-white swords that looked like pig iron floating in the air. In this moment, Zhang Guangdao's vital energy surged out of his body and flooded into the copper box. These dozens of small silver swords gave off mountainous presences. The small silver swords, in the perception of these cultivators, were like tin mountains that flew into the air. The air, or more accurately, the flowing primal energies of the universe, was filled with the presence of tin. The grandmasters in the primal energies of the universe seemed to be filled with tin in their bodies, especially their chests. The dozens of small silver swords fell down like small mountains and sealed off the escape paths of these grandmasters, including Wei Wujiu. All the Qin grandmasters who were enveloped by these sword moves sank into extreme fury. They finally understood what Consort Zhao was relying on. What angered them was not that Consort Zhao's method of resolving this situation was the stronger Chu weapon, but the betrayal of their own people. Zhang Guangdao had the Tin Mountain Sword Box. The cultivators of the world were familiar with this seal weapon. Just before the Deer Mountain Conference, in the trap against Zhao Si and by Shan Shui on the Wei River, this seal weapon had appeared to block Bai Shan Shui's path. While Bai Shan Shui had been stopped for a moment, he had still defeated the Tin Mountain Sword Box. At this time, it was impossible for the Tin Mountain Sword Box to seal off many opponents like Bai Shan Shui for a moment. But other than the Tin Mountain Sword Box, there was another vast sword essence coming down. This sword essence came from Lian Bo, who was quickly retreating. His dark green sword was still flying in the air, but a green long sword had silently appeared in his hand. The green long sword was intertwined with clouds, and within the clouds, fog and torrential rain were constantly being generated. He was the person closest to Zhang Guangdao and had the highest chance of stopping Zhang Guangdao. Yet his sword did not fall towards Zhang Guangdao, but towards the Qin grandmasters surrounded by the Tin Mountain Sword Tray. The power contained in this blue, long sword even surpassed the life-bond sword he had nurtured for many years. The clouds and mist on the sword splashed out along with the momentum of his sword. In the perception of these grandmasters, it was as if the clouds and rain in the distant Mount Wu were all drawn over, rushing into this cramped space like flood dragons. Several loud shouts were heard. All the Qin grandmasters trapped in the sword moves of the Tin Mountain Sword Tray reacted, but they did not target Zhang Guangdao or Lian Bo. Instead, they used their strongest defensive moves. Because they were not ordinary cultivators, they were grandmasters, so they knew that with Lian Bo's sword, they did not have enough time to charge out. Consort Zhao had arrived. There was a loud explosion. Consort Zhao had appeared in the area sealed by the Tin Mountain Sword Tray. She did not target anyone. Like a meteor falling from the sky, she smashed into this area and hit the ground. Her speed was faster than anyone here. When she arrived, the Chu weapon in her hand had been completely activated. The light seals that surged out like golden ants had formed a golden curtain of light. The sword energy of the Tin Mountain Sword Tray, the sword energy of Lian Bo's sword, and the power released by the other Qin grandmasters in the sealed area as they defended with all their strength attacked and cut this golden curtain of light. This golden curtain of light immediately shattered and gave off even more terrifying power. A golden sun formed in the area sealed by dozens of small silver swords. Lian Bo's sword intent and the clouds and rain formed by his sword were instantly shattered by the golden light and evaporated into nothingness. Poof! He first spat out a mouthful of blood. Unable to hold his long sword, he was sent flying backwards. Then came the dozens of small silver swords stuck in the ground. Like a collapsing mountain, These small silver swords flew backwards in all kinds of positions. Zhang Guangdao's hands that gripped the Tin Mountain sword tray gave off the sound of bones cracking. The spreading golden light hit his body, and then his bones cracked. He was bathed in the bloody mist that seeped out of his flesh. There was a violent explosion in the golden light. It was as if a huge ship was crashing into a thick cliff. Every impact caused the earth to shake and the mountains to shake. Xiang Yin came to the edge of the golden sun, created by the explosion as the small silver swords flew away. His expression was grave to the extreme. He waved the golden dagger axe in his hand dozens of times in an instant, cutting apart a mass of golden light that was rushing towards him. His body was barely able to stabilize his body amidst the huge shock. His palms and fingers were dripping with blood. The golden light only burst outwards for a short moment and then started to disappear. It looked like it was shrinking inwards. The entire space felt like a piece of burning red coal. Even the primal energies of the universe seemed to have been burned to ash, fixed in the air, and then peeled off layer by layer. A Qin Grandmaster was the first to appear. This was Peng Yugu of Fenghe Province. His birth was illustrious, and he had once cultivated at Lingshu Sword Gate. Where the golden light passed, his figure appeared in the air. His clothes were not disheveled at all. A life-bond, sword essence burned like a torch in his right hand. Seeing such a figure, Xiang Yan's pupils shrank slightly, and his expression became extremely solemn. But in the next moment, multiple explosions came from this Qin Grandmaster's body. Multiple bloody holes appeared on his arms. Blood gushed out. His body fell hard to the ground like a mountain. The golden light shrank in front of Consort Zhao. Consort Zhao's figure appeared. She was standing, but her white jade-like hands were covered in cracks with drops of glowing blood flowing out. In this area, only two people could stand. Other than Consort Zhao, the other was Wei Wujiu. Xiang Yin took a deep breath. Even though this result was very favorable to him, this scene still made him feel unusually frightened and even made his body constantly tremble with coldness. He had never thought that this seal weapon could release such power. Wei Wujiu's robes were dyed red, but most of it was not his blood, but the blood of the cultivator who had been following him. The cultivation of the cultivator under him was definitely above average among these grandmasters, but right now, his injuries were the most serious, so serious that he was about to die. Some had betrayed, and some had protected with their lives. This is not a matter of one person's life and death. Wei Wujiu supported his dying subordinate with one hand. His gaze did not land on Consort Zhao, but on Lian Bo and Zhang Guangdao. We overlooked a problem. How could something like the Tin Mountain sword box appear in your hands because of Li Lingjuan's trade? But as a Wei person, you have become a marquis of the Qin dynasty. I do not understand what you are dissatisfied about. I do not understand why you can ignore the kindness of the Qin dynasty. Chapter 596. Once he became a marquis, his origins and many of his past deeds would not be a secret. From a certain point of view, every person who started as an ordinary cultivator and became a powerful marquis had a legendary experience. These legends were widely spread, recorded in the history books or the books of the cultivation world, and even changed into many versions of the story. Lian Bo's origins were not a secret. He had once been a Wei person, but the former Wei dynasty had inadvertently fallen into the trap of the Qin and relied too much on Cloud Water Palace. When the Qin had deliberately allowed Cloud Water Palace to be the only power in the Wei dynasty, his sect had stood against Cloud Water Palace and was mercilessly sacrificed. His sect had been destroyed by the decree of the Wei emperor. He carried the blood debt of his sect and fled to Chongling. He became a general of the Qin army in Chongling and led his army into the Wei imperial palace. Even if he could not kill the Wei emperor himself, he had taken revenge for his sect. His growth and revenge could not be separated from the help of the Qin, especially when the Yuanwu emperor did not care that he was a Wei person and gave him the same respect. He used his military achievements to confer him the title of one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. What an honor this was. Even if anyone were to comment on this, it would still be a great favor to him. At the beginning, The 13 Qin grandmasters had worked together to kill Consort Zhao. But because of Lian Bo and Zhang Quangdao's betrayal, 8 grandmasters were trapped in the sword formation of the Tin Mountain Sword Box. At this time, the strongest swordsman under Wei Wujiu's command had died, and the others were seriously injured. While there were 2 grandmasters outside, Consort Zhao still had Xiang Yan by her side. The 2 uninjured Qin grandmasters outside the sword formation and Wei Wujiu himself would not be able to kill Consort Zhao and Xiang Yan even if they won. At least, they would not be able to stop Consort Zhao from escaping. Also, Consort Zhao might have other moves. In reality, no matter what Chu weapons Consort Zhao had, if not for Lian Bo and Zhang Quangdao's betrayal, she would have undoubtedly died today. This was enough to change this battle, and even the entire history of the world. But she had died at Lian Bo's hands. How could Wei Wujiu not feel pain? He even felt great sorrow. He felt that Lian Bo needed to give an explanation, and he also knew that Lian Bo would definitely give an explanation. Lian Bo sat on the ground with a pale face. His expression was very complicated. Perhaps it was because of his heavy injuries, but his eyes were very dim. It's actually very simple. He took a deep breath, met Wei Wujiu's gaze, and said, "I met her a long time ago when I was cultivating in Wei. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have been able to escape Wei and would have died long ago. Only by surviving can I continue to cultivate and fight." After a moment of silence, he continued, "I became a noble in the Qin dynasty largely because of my cultivation and battles. I also made many contributions to the Qin dynasty in destroying the Wei kingdom. So in terms of kindness, her kindness to me is greater than the Qin dynasty's kindness to me. Can we count it that way?" Wei Wujiu laughed angrily. "Can kindness be divided into such a simple order? No, you can't. As long as you owe a debt of gratitude, how can you distinguish it clearly?" Lian Bo also laughed. His smile contained countless emotions. He persisted as he slowly stood up. "If this is shamelessness, then it is my matter. If I die, it has nothing to do with anyone." Wei Wujiu and the 2 uninjured Qin grandmasters suddenly felt a chill. From Lian Bo's words, they realized what was about to happen. "Thank you." Lian Bo's smile grew brighter. He said to Consort Zhao with a smile, "Getting revenge is the happiest thing in the world. That day, when I led the army into the Wei Palace, I was so happy that I was willing to die. Later, when I stayed in Chongling and was made a marquis, I was at a loss and did not know what else to do. The kindness owed is only heavy." His words were not loud, but in the ears of Wei Wujiu and these Qin grandmasters, they were like thunder. Wei Wujiu and the 2 Qin grandmasters who were not seriously injured were naturally on guard. The vital essence in their bodies began to circulate wildly. Pew 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 pew. Before he finished speaking, Lian Bo's body seemed to be penetrated by countless sharp swords. The remaining vital energy and primal energies of the universe in his body sprayed out of his meridians. Then his body flew up and fell from the sky in an instant. However, a joyous sword intent had already formed in his hand and slashed out. Dampness formed in the air and gathered in his sword essence. This sword light was like an enormous red carp that leapt towards Wei Wujiu. Wei Wujiu was speechless. This sword contained Lian Bo's vitality. The strength of the sword essence was even greater than Lian Bo at his peak. In this moment, he could only defend again. His life-bond sword that had returned to his hand gave off gray frost. There seemed to be many transparent walls of frost in the air. There was a deafening boom. His figure was still standing steadily, but his hands were trembling nonstop. A lot of frost stained his body. Many bone-deep wounds appeared on his body. Blood gushed out from these wounds like a cheerful spring. 2 killing intents fell towards Consort Zhao. The 2 Qin grandmasters did not care about Wei Wujiu. They just wanted to use this moment to kill Consort Zhao. But at this time, Consort Zhao looked up and grinned at Wei Wujiu. Her expression was unusually serious. "Now, it is my turn to try to kill you." A muffled sound. A figure stumbled back along with the sword essence. Xiang Yin pushed back this Qin grandmaster with his dagger axe, but blood appeared in his palms again. At this time, a snow-white sword light fell towards Consort Zhao's waist. This sword essence was pure and focused. The Qin Grandmaster who had attacked came from Qiu Mountain Sword School and was called Qi Ruoxing. He was a legend in Chongling. His talent was not astounding, and even his comprehension was lacking compared to his fellow disciples. Qiu Mountain Sword School was only a second-rate cultivation place in Chongling. Yet he cultivated a simple sword manual and became the only Realm 7 cultivator of Qiu Mountain Sword School. Because of his focus, his attack was steady and terrifying. Consort Zhao moved like the wind towards Wei Wujiu, as though she had no attention to spare for this attack. Xiang Yan's attack was finished. Seeing that he could no longer block such a sword, he did something that these Qin Grandmasters had not expected at all. His figure moved forward, and in an extremely simple manner, he blocked the sword like a shield. The snow-white sword light stabbed Xiang Yan's body. Where the sword light pointed, Xiang Yan's clothes fell apart piece by piece. However, when the tip of the sword entered his flesh, there was no sound of flesh being cut apart by a sharp weapon. Instead, there was a muffled clang, as if the sword had stabbed into a steel wall. The sword tip entered half an inch into the flesh, but could not penetrate further. The sword energy only went in half an inch. Xiang Yan's face turned ashen. With a poof, he spat out a mouthful of blood mixed with powerful vital energy and primal energies of the universe like countless bloody sword lights. Qi Ruoxing screamed, his left hand forming a sword seal. The sword light swept away the blood energy. In a rush, the energies in his body roiled. Wei Wujiu's pupils contracted to their limits. He looked at Consort Zhao, who was charging at him. He did not choose to flee, but gave a beast-like growl. He gathered all of his vital energy into a bundle and gathered it into his life-bond sword. His life-bond sword contracted rapidly according to his thoughts, turning into a finger-thick sword. With terrifying speed, it stabbed towards Consort Zhao's heart meridian. A path of light was left in the air, rippling with the presence of mutual destruction. Consort Zhao looked at the sword light heading for her heart meridian. She did not change her direction. Her seemingly small body exploded with a terrifying power, like a tsunami. She also gave an unimaginable scream. With a boom, her fist also smashed towards Wei Wujiu's heart meridian. A visible pillar of wind appeared in front of her fist due to the pressure of her power. In this moment, countless people on the battlefield shouted in shock. Everyone knew that she cultivated her own body. However, Wei Wujiu's sword pursued extreme, penetrative power. How could any physical body block it? Sword and fist collided. Was this really the result of mutual destruction? The sword light landed on her body and illuminated her jade-like face. Yet her body only shook, and the sword light did not pierce her body. Boom! Her fist smashed into Wei Wujiu's body, but it did not send him flying. Instead, it directly smashed through Wei Wujiu's body and lifted him onto her arm. Everyone on the battlefield stopped breathing for a moment. Even the flow of time seemed to stop. Wei Wujiu's feet left the ground. His power had completely disappeared, but he did not die. He looked in disbelief at Consort Zhao's heart meridian and saw an ancient copper mirror flashing with dim yellow light. I told you before, I am the Empress Dowager of the Chu dynasty. The strongest of the Chu weapons in the world are naturally with me. Consort Zhao coughed up blood and said proudly, "Pity that you are too pedantic. Even the most cunning fox cannot change its habits and will always fall into the trap of the hunter." Chapter 597. The light in Wei Wujiu's eyes quickly dimmed. He looked at Consort Zhao and responded softly before he died. "Originally, I only admired one woman. You were the second." Consort Zhao nodded, pulled back her fist, and allowed his body to slide off her arm to the ground. Without a doubt, her risk had succeeded. But she also knew that the final victory would depend on the Yin Mountain. When she turned and looked in the direction of the Yin Mountain, most of the Qin army had finished gathering. The Qin army, surrounding Tianqi City, was about to start a new round of attacks. Because Sima Qiu viewed this isolated city of the Chu army as the key to victory, He gave the order to take this city before nightfall, and then quickly set up defenses to attack the main force of the Chu army. So the attack this time was different from the previous ones. They could not care about casualties or the wear and tear of armaments. Countless arrows rained down on the city. The arrowheads of these arrows were made from phosphorus stone. After the friction with the air, they started to burn and turned into balls of fire. The archers of the Qin army pulled on their bowstrings. These expensive arrows were being used crazily in their hands like free withered twigs. Because of their pursuit of extreme speed, the fingers of these archers started to bleed and their arms started to tremble. Most of the seal weapons had been used up in the first round of attacks. At this time, in this isolated city, surrounded by the Qin army, most places were burning. There were pillars of smoke rising into the sky, and the air was filled with all kinds of burning smells. One of the Qin army's heavy armored cavalry started to charge towards a broken part of the city wall. Their heavy iron hose hit the ground and caused the rubble on the wall to jump. At this time, a sharp sound of breaking through the air suppressed all other sounds. In the next moment, the Qin army gave earth-shaking cheers. It turned out that at this moment, a batch of heavy crossbow machines from the Qin army had been moved to this place. Several hundred heavy crossbow bolts, as thick as a baby's arm, fiercely plunged into the broken section of the city wall, followed by another round of crossbow bolts. In just a moment, 3 rounds of crossbow bolts were fired. Over 1,000 heavy crossbow bolts nailed the area around the city wall into a forest, and the frightening force stirred up waves of dust that spread outwards. However, amidst the cheers that shook the earth, amidst the clouds of dust that splashed up as the crossbow bolts fiercely pierced the wall and the mud within, a figure appeared at the broken wall directly in front of the heavy armored cavalry. The moment this figure appeared, a terrifying heat appeared in the dust. Then even the dust seemed to burn, turning into sparks that flew outwards. The figure in the dancing sparks was a tall man. His black hair was not tied up and danced wildly in the sparks. Yet when the Qin soldiers saw his figure, an even brighter ball of fire appeared in his hand. He raised his sword and swung this ball of fire. The sword of the heavens and earth exploded. It was like an enormous cauldron had smashed down, and then turned into a sword essence that cut down. Pew 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 pew. A patch of fiery red fell in front of this crazily charging heavy cavalry. When the several hundred heavy cavalry crashed into this patch of fiery red, their bodies exploded as if they had been set on fire. Countless heavy metal armor pieces flew out. Time seemed to freeze in this moment. Many people swallowed mouthfuls of saliva with difficulty, but they still couldn't breathe smoothly. At the place where the fiery red light landed, a deep sword scar that was more than 1,000 feet long and 10 feet wide had appeared. The broken limbs and armor of the heavy armored cavalry fell into this sword mark and burned. The remaining dozens of cavalry could not advance. Those blindfolded warhorses sensed great terror and could not be controlled by the riders on them. They spun furiously on the spot. The most shocked were the numerous cultivators in the Qin army. Some of the memories that had been buried in their minds for many years started to awaken. This scene seemed familiar. Many years ago, when the Qin dynasty's army had swept through the cities of the Zhao dynasty, there had been a blacksmith shop in one of the cities. There had been a grandmaster in that shop. Then he had come to the city gates alone with a sword and swung his sword at the tide of Qin soldiers. A long sword mark appeared in front of the city. After that, the grandmaster only said one sentence: "Whoever crosses this sword mark will die." Then the entire army was gone. The world knew that the Zhao sword furnace was in that city. Whoever passes this sword mark will die. In the light of the fire, Zhao's black hair turned deep red, dancing like tiny flames. He had followed Tang Mei under his master's orders and left the Zhao for many years. Many memories of the Zhao had faded, but he was someone who had experienced that battle. He and the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace had stood in the city and watched his master use his sword. Looking at the sword that he had executed and the sword scar, the sword strike of his master teacher became clearer and clearer in his memory. Gradually, it began to overlap with the image before his eyes. It was only at this moment that he truly understood the meaning behind his master's sword attack. He said these words, listening to his own voice burning into raging flames. He felt that he was a bit closer to his master from back then, and that he had become a bit stronger. This feeling was very good. Several shrill military orders rang out, and the troops that had been following the heavy cavalry here suddenly began to retreat. Back then, Yuqin people did not dare to face the sword of the Zhao sword furnace head-on. So many years later, no one dares to come out. Zhao Su looked coldly at the Qin army in front of him and said, in terms of invincibility, who was truly invincible back then? When he said this, a strange sound suddenly rang out in the sky where the clouds were flying. This sound was like the cry of a crane, but carried a dark and terrifying presence. Everyone subconsciously looked up at the sky at this moment. A thick, ink-black cloud flew over from the sky, rolling and churning. There seemed to be a crane in the cloud energy, but it had no flesh or feathers. It was just a skeleton, but the skeleton burned with black flames that surpassed the imagination of the people. There are some things you do not understand. A ghostly voice drifted down from the sky. The black cloud retreated, and the black bone crane disappeared. Not far behind the sword mark, there was a cultivator covered in ghost energy standing. This cultivator wore black robes with a high collar. As he looked up at Zhao Su and spoke, black energy flashed around him, forming black plum blossoms and then quickly disappearing. Wang Jingming once agreed to a battle with your master, but your Zhao emperor was too stupid and feared your master would steal his throne just because of some rumors. He first set a trap to kill your master, the cultivator said. This cultivator said serenely, while Wang Jingming and I are mortal enemies, I will speak the truth. I cannot ruin the reputation of all Qin people because of this. Chapter 598. The gentlemen of ancient times ruled the world with benevolence and righteousness. You Qin people Yuanwu stole the country. Zheng Xiu has 2 husbands. Do you care about reputation? Zhao Su raised an eyebrow and said coolly, What did you say? Hearing his words, a wave of angry curses rose from the Qin army. Zhao Su's lips curled slightly, a disdainful expression on his face, but he did not look at the Qin soldiers. The things I am telling you have nothing to do with others, only the Bazin Kendo ground, and the battle between Wang Jingming and your master. The strategist cultivator's expression did not change. Just like before, he said quietly, Some things, regardless of whether you believe them or not, exist. Zhao Su looked at him and asked, Who are you? This cultivator nodded in greeting and said, Shirchang Luo, but many people are used to calling me Ghost Master. Zhao Su stilled slightly and then nodded in greeting. So it is the ghost sword who betrayed the Bazin Kendo ground in the past. I had not thought that after leaving the Bazin Kendo ground, you really cultivated the methods of the Yin and Ghost. The two spoke calmly, but even during this battle, gasps and gasps could be heard inside and outside the city. The significance of the Bazin Kendo ground to the Qin was self-evident. Even though many records about the Bazin Kendo ground had been burned after Yuanwu ascended the throne, for the army, and especially for cultivators, many things and people could not be erased. In the most glorious decades of the Bazin Kendo ground, there had only been one traitor, Shirchang Luo. In the legends, Shirchang Luo's sword essence was unfathomable, so he was called the Ghost Sword. Supposedly, he had become a traitor of the Bazin Kendo ground because he had wanted to assassinate Wang Jingming. In the legends, his talent was close to Wang Jingming's. Because he was too jealous of Wang Jingming's talent, he feared that Wang Jingming would surpass him in the future, so he wanted to assassinate Wang Jingming. After failing, he fell off a cliff, but luckily escaped. When a legendary person reappeared, they usually carried the presence of an era and caused the air to grow heavy. But Shirchang Luo's expression was very calm. He said, There is no difference in cultivation methods. Use them if they are useful. Such an indifferent attitude caused Zhao Su's expression to become even more solemn. He felt as though he was being stared at by a ferocious beast. He looked at Shirchang Luo and said seriously, The rumor is that you betrayed the Bazinkindo ground because you were jealous of Wang Jingming's failed assassination. But you are not a narrow-minded person. Without determining life and death, how can one know who is strong and who is weak? Shi Changluo's tone suddenly became sinister. If I lose to him, I naturally have nothing to say, but if I kill him, it proves that he is not as strong as me. Zhao Su frowned. So it's the sword fanatic. Shi Changluo glanced at this grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace and felt countless complicated emotions. But in a moment, his mind became absolutely calm without any ripples. Why not kill Yuan Wu? Zhao Su could not help but ask. The expressions of many Qin soldiers changed again. While I escaped and did not die in the Bazinkindo ground, I was seriously injured and my progress has slowed. If we are both realm-mate, maybe I should try, Shi Changluo responded with a calm expression. Everyone could hear his meaning. He admitted that he could not keep up with Yuan Wu. Otherwise, if he and Yuan Wu were the only ones in the world, then he would fight to the death with Yuan Wu to see who was strong and who was weak. Zhao Su was silent for a long time. He took a deep breath and looked up into Shi Changluo's eyes. He asked solemnly, "In the past, Wang Jingming really set a date with my master to fight." Shi Changluo said coldly, "You should know about the flying sword that killed the moon in the Mirror Lake and burned the sulfur pond. Mirror Lake was originally in the Wu province of the Zhao. In the past, when the Qin and Zhao were fighting, the Qin army had taken Wu province. Wang Jingming had looked at Mirror Lake at night and used a sword. The water had not rippled, but the reflection of the moon in the Mirror Lake had split into two halves. There was a hot spring in Quan City of the Zhao border called the Sulphur Pond. The water was yellow and warm and was dozens of hectares wide. One day, that grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace had used a sword on this sulphur pond, evaporating the sulphur pond and even stopping the flow of the hot spring. These two matters had happened a long time ago, but they represented the peak of sword skill and cultivation in the world of cultivators. Just like Yuan Wu flattening a mountain with a sword at the Deer Mountain Conference, they were fated to be passed down in the world of cultivators. Especially the burning of the sulphur pond by the grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace. Later, many stories said that he had been dissatisfied with the emperor of the Zhao dynasty, so he had used that sword to pressure him. Not long after, he had been killed by the emperor of the Zhao dynasty. These were all old matters, and the twists and turns were hard to explain. But today, with people like Shi Changluo and Zhao Su gathered, it was possible to sort them out. Especially for Zhao Su, these matters were more important than his own life and death. "So you mean that my master burned the sulphur pond in response to Wang Jingming's sword?" He looked at Shi Changluo and asked slowly. Shi Changluo sneered. "The time between the two matters is about the time the news reached the Zhao sword furnace. You should know your master better than me. With his personality, would he be so bored as to use a sword like that to intimidate the emperor of the Zhao?" Zhao Su was silent for a moment. Then he bowed and said, "I would like to hear the details." "Very simple." Shi Changluo said, "Previously, the city where the Zhao sword furnace was at was just an ordinary city that the Qin army had destroyed along the way. But no one had thought that there would be a sword furnace there, and a grandmaster like that, and many powerful cultivators like you. Your master destroyed a Qin army in one move. For the Bazinkindo ground at the time, even if they sent many cultivators and armies to destroy your city, even if they killed your master, if you escaped, it would be a disaster. So Wang Jingming wanted to gamble with a battle. If he won against your master, the Zhao sword furnace would leave the city, and the Qin army would leave the city. But the people of the Zhao sword furnace would not interfere in the war between the Qin and Zhao." After a pause, Shi Changluo said with slight disdain, "That was the best method. If it was me, I would do the same." Zhao Su asked, "What does this have to do with those two matters?" "Wang Jingming is different from me. Perhaps he felt that a battle without life and death was the best, so he attacked first. If your master knew that he was no match for him, there would have been no need for this battle. However, your master intentionally returned his attack." Shi Changluo lowered his head slightly and said. Zhao Su's eyes were complicated. He started to speak, but his words became slow. So my master felt that he and Wang Jingming were opponents. Otherwise, with his personality, if Wang Jingming's attack was not as good as his, he would not have attacked. If Wang Jingming was much better than him, he would not have attacked. Shi Changluo said coolly, "You finally understand." Inside and outside the city, many soldiers and cultivators were in a state of great shock at this moment. So the strongest person of the Qin dynasty and the grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace had been opponents. They had even agreed on a time to fight. But before victory was decided, the grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace had died in the Zhao dynasty's scheme. Chapter 599. In other words, so many people of the Zhao sword furnace have wrongly blamed him. Zhao sighed softly. But he did not have a good ending, even worse than my master. My master did not believe in people and stood aloof from worldly affairs, but he believed in the wrong person. Shi Changluo looked noncommittally at him and did not say anything. His battle with Wang Jingming had changed the trajectory of his life. If there was no such person as Wang Jingming in this world, maybe he would be the strongest person in the world, the sword maniac of the Bazenkendo ground, the strongest genius. But even though he had failed to assassinate Wang Jingming back then, and his cultivation progress had slowed down due to his serious injuries, which had greatly affected his cultivation, that had been his own choice. He did not feel much hatred towards an enemy like Wang Jingming. Zhao Su thought and then asked seriously, "Then honestly speaking, if Wang Jingming and my master fought back then, who do you think would have won?" Shi Changluo shook his head. "Logically speaking, I think your master will win. Wang Jingming has no moves he cannot defeat. Any moves are at his fingertips, and any moves in his hands will become wondrous. His sword moves are wondrous, and each flow of energy seems to be in its original position. But even the most exquisite sword moves have traces to follow. Your master sword moves are sometimes like intuition, a natural reaction of a swordsman's body and energy. But no one can say for certain things like this. Someone's opinion does not represent the result. A swordsman will experience countless stages in their life. Wang Jingming, when he fought the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, is different from the Wang Jingming who fought in Chongling. Think about how old your master was back then, and how long Wang Jingming had cultivated the sword. If everyone had another decade, who would have one? You are right. On this matter, the people of the Zhao sword furnace have been too stubborn. Zhao Sun nodded and did not speak more. He raised his sword, held it across his chest, and said to Shi Changluo, "Please." When he said the word please, it meant that the battle had truly started. The terrifying heat that had been surging and expanding in the air suddenly disappeared, returning to his body and the long sword in his hand. The flames on the long sword in his hand that had been surging with dazzling red flames disappeared. The entire long sword became like ordinary iron. However, his entire person seemed to have swallowed all of the flames. His skin gave off a red, jade-like luster. The most frightening thing about him was his eyes. His eyes had completely turned crimson red, sparkling and translucent like gems, completely filled with a wild and ruthless aura. There was no normal humanity in him. He was completely demonic. In the world of cultivators, if a cultivator completely fell into the world created by his own sword intent, his mind sinking into it and unable to extricate himself, he would be considered a demonic cultivator. This was a very frightening thing for cultivators. However, Zhao Su's first sword had caused him to fall into a demonic state. His sword had yet to truly pierce out, but the world around him and Shi Changluo was already filled with his demonic killing intent. Large clouds of gray dust started to appear in the empty sky that ordinary cultivators would see, falling down like gray snow. A black ripple spread out from Shi Changluo's body like water. Then the ripple turned into a wave that slammed into the surrounding void. Shi Changluo started to pull out his sword. There was nothing in his hand, but when his right hand reached out from his chest, a pitch-black sword hilt appeared in his right hand. One end of the sword was connected to his chest with thick, ghostly energy. For a moment, even the sounds of the siege quieted. From a certain point of view, This could be considered a fight between the Zhao sword furnace and the Bazinkindo ground. All the cultivators inside and outside the city knew that the two were fighting in the space. A strange life-bond presence expanded as Shi Changluo pulled out his sword. Thick black life-bond energy surged out of his chest, and then turned into a sword in Shi Changluo's hand. He seemed to be pulling out a pitch-black bone from his body. His movements were very slow. The scene at this time was very strange. It looked like one person was focused on pulling out the sword, and the other was silently letting himself fall into a demonic state. But more and more gray dust fell from the air. When the tip of the pitch-black sword finally appeared in Shi Changluo's hand, he finished drawing the sword. The moment the sword tip separated from his body, it drew out hundreds of black lines. Then, a figure was pulled out of his body by these black lines. With this sword, Shi Changluo seemed to have pulled out his soul. All the gray dust falling from the air and the gray dust on the ground danced wildly and surged toward Zhao Si's body. The gray dust piled up like a shell and covered Zhao Si's body, turning him into a gray stone statue. But in the next moment, the statue's eyes started to burn, revealing a pair of blood-red eyes. This statue seemed to have fallen into a demonic state. A cracking sound came from the sword in Zhao Si's hand. Many burning dust particles flew out from the cracks on the gray stone shell of the sword. Then, these dust particles scattered and cut off the cultivator's perception. Everyone could clearly see that Zhao Si was standing there. The stone shell was cracking and burning, but no one could sense his existence. First, he fell into a demonic state, and then his perception was cut off. This was like the supreme sword essence of the Lingshu sword gate. Shi Changluo could not sense Zhao Si's existence in his perception, but he was not affected at all. He knew that his previous attack could not defeat Zhao Si, and what Zhao Si was using now was not his strongest move. The pitch-black sword in his hand gave a soft hum. Many black humanoid yuan qi surged outwards. A black dot of light suddenly appeared on the ground in front of Zhao Si, and then formed a black bamboo shoot. A strange power grew with the growth of the bamboo shoot, constantly attacking the space where Zhao Si was. Pieces of glass-like crystal light scattered in all directions, as if many mirrors had shattered at the same time. Zhao Si's figure completely disappeared from there. In the next moment, when he appeared in front of everyone's eyes, he was less than 70 feet in front of Shi Changluo. Boom! The demonic light in his eyes had already disappeared, but his entire body and long sword were burning fiercely like never before, exploding outwards. Then, with a simple and ruthless slash of his sword, the flames rose again, surrounding his body to form a true furnace of flames. Then, this entire furnace of flames was like a drop of water, flowing down from the tip of his sword. Space shook again, enveloping Shi Changluo within. Shi Changluo's pitch-black sword disappeared. He raised his hand slightly, and a thin wisp of black smoke flew up from where his black life-bond sword had disappeared. His entire body was divided into two colors, black and white. The left half of his body was so black that his face could not be seen clearly, while the right half of his body was dazzlingly white. Tens of thousands of rays of light shot out, and a terrifying force condensed into a line, cutting the great furnace apart from the middle. Zhao Si's brow furrowed deeply. He did not know where Shi Changluo had cultivated the Yin and Ghost method, but it had merged with the Bazinkindo ground sword manual. The power was so strange that he could not measure it. The moment the great furnace sword was broken, he felt a formless whirlpool appear in front of him. This invisible whirlpool had the power of extreme yang and extreme yin. A part of the power came from the sword he had just used. He could not defeat Shi Changluo's attack. He was even certain that before today, if he faced Shi Changluo like this, he could not win. But today he did not think so, because when he drew that sword mark earlier, he felt as if he'd been there, and he'd finally captured the charm of his master's sword strike from all those years ago. He did not have any other thoughts in his mind. He simply swung his sword again and drew that sword mark. The red sword swept through the air in front of him. A red sword mark appeared in the air. Chapter 600. There was a soft hiss. A scorch mark appeared on Sher Changlua's chest. A gray mist appeared in his eyes. His entire body flew backwards, but his feet remained close to the ground as he glided. Zhao Su maintained his posture of swinging his sword. The whirlpool in front of him was cut open by this sword mark and then started to burn. Dust the size of a palm gushed out from the space a few feet in front of him, as if a pile of withered leaves of a parasol tree was placed in the wind and blown outwards. A layer of black energy shrouded Sher Changlua's feet and the ground. A terrifying power landed on the ground under his feet, causing spiderweb-like cracks to appear on the ground. Sher Changluo was slightly shocked. He could not understand why the other's casual attack was so powerful. Zhao Su was also slightly shocked. He could not understand why the sword essence had clearly entered the other's body, but the other had used a strange method to resolve the power that had entered his body. Sher Changluo was flying back, and Zhao Su was still swinging his sword. This scene, in the eyes of everyone inside and outside the city, was that Sher Changluo was not a match. But at this time, Zhao Su and some of the strongest cultivators on the battlefield noticed some details. Some deep gray energy surged out of the spiderweb-like cracks on the ground. These deep gray energies were like dried bones sticking out of the ground, giving off a rotten smell. But they quickly drew in fresh energy from this part of the world. Freshness was just formed and relative. This kind of energy gave off a strong yin and cold presence. It came from the blood and bodies of the cultivators who had just died on the battlefield. This was yin energy. The energy that cultivators who cultivated the path of ghosts needed came from death, from the aura released after the deaths of some creatures who had been extremely powerful when they were alive and had accumulated large amounts of primal energy of the world in their bodies. This was why cultivators who cultivated the path of ghosts often needed to cultivate in some ancient graveyards. But there were very few cultivators who could gather large amounts of yin energy outside their bodies to fight the enemy. Especially on a battlefield covered in corpses, such a move could only be described as terrifying. The cultivators who could sense these details, including Zhao Su himself, knew that Sher Changluo's next attack would be even stronger. From a certain point of view, Zhao Su's attack just now possessed the essence of the legendary Zhao Sword Furnace Grandmaster. It was not much different from his master's attack back then. This was, of course, the strongest sword move that Zhao Su could display. If even such a sword could not defeat Sher Changluo, then how could he possibly win? In the eyes of all the cultivators who noticed these details, Zhao Su's defeat was certain. However, Zhao Su himself did not think so. He drew his sword. Just now, the sword mark was a light slash in the air. This time, he simply raised his sword and slashed at Sher Changluo. The air in front of him suddenly became extremely hot. Even the people several hundred meters away could feel the heat wave blowing against their faces. This kind of heat was not unfamiliar to the surrounding cultivators. In the records of the cultivation world, the cultivators of the Zhao Sword Furnace had been accompanied by fire for a long time. In their daily cultivation, their bodies contained endless fire essence, and the primal energies of the universe accumulated in their bodies were unusually hot. But to everyone's shock, the heat surpassed any of Zhao Su's previous attacks, and even caused people to feel disbelief. It was also at this moment that many exclamations naturally sounded. Zhao Su's fiery red sword started to burn. This unprecedented heat came from the burning of the sword in his hand. Previously, his sword had always flowed with flames, even burning vital energy that was as viscous as magma. However, right now, all of these cultivators who couldn't help but cry out in alarm could clearly see that his sword was truly starting to burn from the inside out. This sword gave off a strong life bond presence. Naturally, this was the life bond sword that Zhao Su had nurtured for many years. The vital energy and primal energies of the universe in the bodies of the Zhao Sword Furnace cultivators were so hot they could melt metal. So the sword cores they had spent many years to forge were the best in the world and could withstand high temperatures. Especially a life bond sword that had been forged for many years. It was a divine weapon that no craftsman in the world could forge. But at this time, Zhao Si used a violent method to cause his sword to burn. It was truly cracking, collapsing, and burning like dry wood. This had nothing to do with sword essence. It was an unusually pure slash, but the wild increase in temperature brought a wild increase in power. There was no room to maneuver. In that instant, his life-bound sword turned into a ball of raging flames with a boom. Then he raised this ball of raging flames and slashed at Shi Changluo. But this was just the beginning. His vital energy and primal energies of the universe started to burn and turned into terrifying heat. Pew pew pew, explosions occurred everywhere in the air. The threads of energy coming out of the ground all started to burn. The entire space seemed to be locked down by the fire, and the primal energies of the universe and the surroundings were being furiously pulled in. A breath ago, Shi Changluo's expression had been calm. He was certain he could win this battle. But in this moment, his face was ashen, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. This was the burning of a cultivator's life, vital energy, and life. It had determination and daring that could not be surpassed in the world. And he could not match the power of this sword. He also knew the fundamental reason he could not match the other. He thought that victory in the sword path was determined by life and death. But the other sword path disregarded life and death. Regardless of whether he could win or not, the other would die, and he would die as well. What was the meaning in this kind of victory? Death's sword. These three words clearly appeared in his mind. This was Wang Jingming's evaluation of the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace back then. When these three words clearly appeared in his mind, an indescribable bitterness filled his mouth and filled his entire body. Even many years later, when he faced Wang Jingming of the past, he still could not win. Because back then, Wang Jingming already knew the true terror of the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace. He knew that the strongest of the Zhao sword furnace was this kind of death sword that disregarded life and death, but he still had the courage to challenge that grandmaster to a duel. But right now, he did not have the courage to face Zhao Si's sword. An indescribable cry of pain came from his mouth. All of his vital energy and primal energies of the universe burst out. Countless black flowers bloomed in the air. The power of these flowers did not go forward, but wrapped around his body and tore open the space behind him. In everyone's sight, Shi Changluo's skin was scorched and dry. All he could do was to frantically flee backwards, turning into a wisp of green smoke. This sword had forced Shi Changluo to use all of his power. The burning life-bond sword in Zhao Si's hand disappeared. His vital energy was forced out and turned into hundreds of streams of fire in the air in front of him. More than half of the qi and blood in his body had been burned dry by himself. Even a single breath of his at this moment brought up several wisps of flames. Chapter 601. More than half of the meridians in his body had been burned, and all his cultivation was gone. He was no different from a cripple. However, he was still immersed in the true meaning of the sword he had just used. He had an epiphany about the sword realm, and felt that he was closer to his master's sword realm. His vision was blurry. Amidst the steam, the sunlight came from behind him, and his shadow fell in front of him. In a daze, he seemed to have returned to the time when he was learning the sword in the Zhao sword furnace. He had followed behind his beloved master. At that time, his master was like a mountain whose peak could not be seen, surrounded by clouds and mist. He did not know how far away he was from him, and he could not even see how high his master was. But now, his figure seemed to gradually merge with the figure of his master in his memory. He seemed to have met his master again. This feeling was so good that he did not care about his body's condition. Is it worth it? Don't you still have us? At this moment, a concerned voice entered his ears, and a pair of firm and strong hands supported his tottering body. These hands belonged to Tang Zhifeng. Tang Zhifeng stood next to him, frowning deeply, and his eyes filled with unspeakable worry. Zhao Si, who usually had a cold expression, smiled at his expression. He allowed his body to press against Tang Zhifeng's hands, and then responded with some pride, "This is the reputation of the Zhao sword furnace. Of course it is worth it. Also, even if I cannot use the sword, I have tested my master's two swords. The Zhao sword furnace still has Zhao E and Zhao C. As long as I tell them what I have learned, it is worth it. Tang Zhifeng was stunned. Then he shook his head and sighed. Your Zhao sword furnace is so terrifying. Zhao Si did not respond to his words. Instead, he raised his head forcefully. Shi Changluo's figure appeared in his blurry vision. Shi Changluo struggled to stand. His body was a little crooked. His skin was charred and cracked like scorched earth. However, there was fresh flesh growing in the cracks like a snake shedding its skin. What was even stranger was that his skin was black. This seemed to be a strange healing method, but everyone could feel that this healing process was very difficult. The powerful aura and extremely cold aura on his body disappeared without a trace. I think Wang Jingming is not as good as my master. Zhao Su looked at Shi Changluo. He did not discuss the outcome of this battle and said, My master is not just strong, he also raised a group of disciples like us. Shi Changluo was silent for a moment. Then he nodded in acknowledgement. Nanjiu looked in the direction of Tianqi City. A huge cloud appeared in the sky above Heavenly Awakening City. It was like a city in the sky was pressing down on Heavenly Awakening City. This meant that a new Grandmaster had appeared and entered the battle. Nanjiu was a cultivator of the Zhuo Mountain Sword School. The Zhuo Mountain Sword School was one of the cultivation places that qualified to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials. However, they had not had an outstanding performance for many years. Before the warden's office had transferred him from Chongling to the front lines, he had only cultivated in the Zhuo Mountain Sword School for 3 years. Therefore, he was only a very young cultivator, a very young soldier. In one of the greatest wars in the history of the dynasty, he had often existed as a hidden sentry. Right now, he was on a nameless hill. He was still half a day's journey away from the battlefield in Heavenly Awakening City. He could barely make out the changing weather above Heavenly Awakening City, as well as the silhouettes of the many armies that were moving through the wilderness like long snakes. On one of the main roads below the nameless hill he was on, there was currently a fleet of carriages slowly moving past. This train of carriages looked ordinary, but based on the experience he had accumulated during this time, he could judge that the Qin commander of the Yin Mountain region, Sima Qiuo, was sitting in one of the carriages. This train of carriages was going to reach Tianqi City before nightfall. Could the marquis in this train of carriages lead the Qin army to victory here? Looking at the clouds in the distance, looking at the army that stretched out like a long snake, Nanjiu felt exceptionally small and helpless. However, it was also at this moment that he sensed an unusual aura. Inexplicably, 3 figures appeared out of nowhere, but right at this moment, they directly entered his line of sight, appearing on the slope in front of him, heading towards the carriage at the bottom of the hill. This sudden intrusion meant that he had not sensed the existence of these people before. He immediately felt his hairs stand on end. If this was a normal time, even if the other was a cultivator of higher cultivation than him, what he would do at this time would be to warn them immediately. However, this feeling of horror was too strong, and it caused his body to become extremely cold and stiff. He couldn't even move a finger. He even felt that his vital energy and blood would freeze in the next moment, and then he would silently die. There was an old man, a woman, and a young person. The old man was an old monk who held a staff. He was so old that each strand of his flesh seemed to have turned into dried tree roots. That woman was peerlessly beautiful. Even her silhouette had a shocking sense of beauty. The young person had a black cloth over his face and seemed exceptionally quiet. While he was frozen in place, the young man seemed to turn his head to look at him and nodded. Because the movement was too subtle, he could not be sure. But this movement caused the coldness in his body to turn into cold sweat that flowed freely. Until the 3 figures disappeared into the forest below him and reappeared closer to the mountain path. He did not move at all, because he knew that there was no meaning in doing anything in front of these 3 people. The terror that filled his body was like the natural terror of the lowest cubs in the natural world, like a young deer facing a giant tiger. The carriages were moving at a steady pace on the road. The sky had originally been clear, but in a flash, it changed color. An enormous dark cloud covered this part of the sky like a snowstorm was about to descend. The path was like night. It was obvious that a powerful grandmaster had come with killing intent. However, this fleet of carriages was strangely quiet. When the darkness came, countless fires lit up silently. On the chariot, there were people holding glowing phosphor stones. The pale white light emitted by the stones scattered the surroundings into a dreamlike scene. Almost all the curtains in the carriages were silently opened. A person in one of the carriages poked his head out and stood silently at the front of the carriage. The light shone on his body. People could easily see that he was Sima Kuo. This level of energy change was enough for him to understand how terrifying the cultivators who came were, especially when the old monk appeared in his perception. However, the expression on his face did not change at all. Instead, there was a sense of relief that he had been waiting for a long time. I just came back from a long trip. I suggest that everyone add my WeChat account, Wuzue1979. Actually, there are daily reports and communications with everyone. Recently, I've been doing a 10-year review of Gangster Master. Because Gangster Master is going to start filming this year, there will be a series of Gangster Master scripts on there. Now, I know that a few episodes have been changed. I will continue to send them every day. Remember the little white flower at the foot of Ualu Mountain? Remember Lulu and Kay? Add them to your memories. The other benefit is that you will know the daily updates. If there is a business trip, everyone will know in time. There is no need to wait for Sword Dynasty's updates. And that's it. Search Wuzue1979 on WeChat and add me. Chapter 602. The dark and cold presence grew. The sky grew darker, and snow started to fall. But this train of carriages was unusually calm. Many carriage drivers even started to hang lanterns on the sides of the carriages. The lanterns swayed in the wind and made soft sounds as they hit the carriages, but the people in the carriages were silent. The atmosphere was strange and mysterious and revealed danger. Ding Ning's mind rippled slightly. Before this, he had been making deductions about this battle many times, trying to guess where exactly Zheng Xiu's final hidden chess piece was, but all along, he came up empty-handed. However, right now, this strange atmosphere in this carriage made his heart suddenly shrink, a bad premonition growing in his heart. Donghu Monk, we should have met in Chongling that year. But you were not outstanding then, and I had not expected you to reach this step. At this time, Sima Kuo looked expressionlessly at them and said, Eldest Miss Gong's son, I had not expected you to reach this step. His voice was deep and powerful, carrying with it a sense of age that could easily pull one's thoughts back to many years ago. And you, while I do not understand how someone like you exists, you should be the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm, his true teachings. His gaze stopped for a long time on Ding Ning, with admiration and emotion. For anyone present, this was not a good time to chat. But Sima Kuo seemed to be chatting. He looked at Ding Ning and said slowly, Do you know the true meaning behind this battle of millions of corpses? His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the hint of conspiracy. There were clearly two terrifying cultivators who were stronger than him coming to assassinate him, but his attitude was like he was the hunter, and the other was just prey that had come to his door. Zhang Sun Qinxue thought of a possibility. Her eyes filled with cold anger. The howling wind in the sky grew stronger and gave off ghostly wails. Ding Ning frowned slightly, but did not respond to Sima Kuo's question. He remained silent. The eldest miss of the Gongsun family and the Bazin Kendo ground are walking together with the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm. And the Donghu monk who tried to kill Wang Jingming in the past is walking with you. This is even more bizarre, but this is not important. Sima Kuo looked sympathetically at Ding Ning and sighed. The true goal behind this battle is you, the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm. His sigh was extremely sincere, but even Ding Ning felt a bone-piercing coldness. Indeed, whether it's the Bazin Kendo ground or I, it's impossible for us not to appear in such a big battle. But using the lives of millions to confirm the existence of the 9-Death Silkworm, to make the 9-Death Silkworm appear, she is becoming crazier. After Ding Ning said this, he looked straight into Sima Kuo's eyes. Assassinating the commander is a method that the Bazin Kendo ground likes to use. But how can you be sure that the 9-death silkworm will appear here, and that I am the 9-death silkworm? In order to complete a definite conclusion, one needed a lot of accurate information to prove it. Before this assassination, Sima Qiu had guessed that Zhongsun Qinxue would come here, and the heir to the 9-death silkworm. That had to be a hidden pawn related to Zheng Xiu. Sima Qiu smiled with slight disdain. He was not in a hurry, so his voice sounded slowly, and he did not even respond to Ding Ning's question. Even if the world is pacified, if the 9-death silkworm is not killed, it will be like a fishbone in the throat, and no one will be at peace. You can judge for yourself which one is more important than sitting on the throne and not being able to eat or sleep in peace in this battle itself. Such a joke? Ding Ning could not help but shake his head. All of this was a joke. He thought that if he could assassinate Sima Qiu, he could win this battle. But what was laughable was that Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu did not care about the outcome of this battle. In their view, the outcome of this battle was not as important as him. Even if I am the heir to the 9-death silkworm, since he can pass it to me, I can pass it to others. How can the 9-death silkworm die? Based on the outcome of this battle, is it worth it? Even if the Chu army wins, they do not have the ability to enter the depths of the Qin dynasty. At most, they will lose Yangshan Commandery. Sima Qiu laughed with slight disdain. Yangshan Commandery has been fighting for a long time and does not have much value. It is good to leave things like rebuilding the city to them. As to the 9-death silkworm method, while it is mysterious and no one knows, at least it is very difficult to cultivate. Other than astounding talents, no one can cultivate it. Even if they can find an heir after a generation, without Wang Jingming's teaching, with the method but no sword manual, what can they accomplish? After a dozen years, it will be another era. Who will be wary of the young silkworms without the support of these grandmasters? Other people could not judge whether it was worth it or not. Ding Ning did not argue with Sima Qiu. He took a deep breath, glanced at Zhongsun Qinxue, and tried to calm himself down. Sima Qiu's carriage did not have an expert strong enough to stop the Donghu monk and Zhongsun Qinxue. This was why he had not expected this to be the place where Zheng Xiu's most dangerous counterattack would be. After many years, Zheng Xiu had not changed in many areas, but in many areas, she had become even more terrifying. So now, who would turn the trap targeting Sima Qiu into a trap targeting him? Zhongsun Qinxue and the Donghu monk? Zhongsun Qinxue slowly turned her head and looked at his face hidden under the black cloth. It was familiar, yet unfamiliar. At the beginning, she had been extremely angry. The angry howls of the wind and snow represented her emotions. The anger came from falling into Zheng Xiu's trap again, but at this time, her emotions had completely calmed down. If we cannot live together, then we will die together. At this time, she said softly to Ding Ning next to her. Because she knew that since the 9-death silkworm was Zheng Xiu's true target in this battle, and this was the trap she had buried, then there would naturally be many more possibilities of death here. They are here. Ding Ning looked at her and nodded. There was the sound of someone breaking branches on the slope behind them. A swordsman in moon-white robes slowly walked out of the forest they had once walked through. The snow falling from the sky was blue and slightly black. This middle-aged man in moon-white robes had snow and ice forming around him, but it was a patch of white. Ding Ning's gaze did not land on this swordsman. He looked up at the top of the hill behind him. There was a man in black robes standing at the top of the hill. He looked down silently, like a proud eagle. It is him. Zhongsun Qinxue's eyes that had just calmed down had complicated emotions. This was shock, worry, and even a hint of bewilderment. Ding Ning's expression froze slightly. In his perception, the black-robed man was taller than the mountain, like a black moon pressing down on the mountain. That black moon had pressed down on Chongling for many years. P.S. I suggest you add my WeChat public number Wuzue 1979. After all, there will be communication with everyone, and you can immediately know my whereabouts and updates. Most importantly, there are pictures of beauties to look at. Chapter 603. Many years before the rise of the Bazankendo ground, there had been many old nobility in Chongling. Some of these old nobles were relatives of the emperor, and their influence in the imperial court was complicated and deeply rooted. Some were extremely powerful officials who held the lifeline of the imperial court in their hands. Not just in Chongling, but some of the Qin dynasty's commanderies had once been under the control of these old nobility. For a long time, the true controller of the Qin dynasty was not the emperor of the Qin dynasty, but these old nobility. These old nobility were keen on cultivating their own power. Their secret partners were even enemies. They cared more about their own interests than the interests of the entire dynasty. In their view, it was not the imperial family who gave them land, but their land and power combined to form the entire dynasty. Because they had been living like royalty for a long time, they were even used to not following the law and using some dark means. Therefore, to them, ordinary people were just crops in the field. They would harvest wave after wave, and no one was really worried about the suffering of the people. The rise of the Bazinkindo ground was due to a group of powerful swordsmen led by Wang Jingming. When Wang Jingming and these swordsmen entered Chongling to promote the reform, they first targeted these old nobility. So the first war of the Qin dynasty was not against the Han, Zhao, and Wei, but against these old nobility. Only the cultivators of the Bazinkindo ground who had experienced those years knew how many cruel battles had occurred and what price they had paid. Every old aristocratic family was like a dynasty. The family of the black-robed man standing on the mountain had once been one of the true rulers of Chongling. When Wang Jingming first walked into Chongling, this black-robed man was already famous. His power covered Chongling like black moonlight. Many years later, when Ding Ning heard the name of this black-robed man again, it was him who had killed Wen Haoling, one of Zheng Xiu's trusted aides. At that time, Ding Ning understood that this black-robed man's terror was not just limited to his family's power. Even his cultivation advancement was beyond his expectations. However, Ding Ning did not understand why such a person would stand on Zheng Xiu's side. Back then, those cruel names had been given by Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. This leader of the old nobility had fought with Zheng Xiu in secret for many years. Ding Ning had never thought that he was Zheng Xiu's man. Therefore, he would never have guessed that Zheng Xiu's hidden pawn was here. Why? Zhang Sun Qinxue raised her head slightly to look at the man in black and asked coldly. At this time, including the cultivator in moon-white robes, there were only 2 more grandmasters here. However, she knew that the arrival of this black-robed man meant the arrival of a terrifying power. It was impossible to easily escape. Why? The black-clothed man calmly looked at her and repeated her question. Then he ran his fingers through his hair. His long hair was as black as ink, but there were many strands of white hair that could not be seen normally. There are many reasons for this question. For example, if the people of the Bazinkindo ground were not so strong, no matter how cruel Zheng Xiu is, she could not have done that. For example, Wang Jingming is too strong. A person like that is like a god. Compared to him, no matter how strong we are just food in the mouth of the gods. A person like that should not exist in the world. He had died, but he had left behind a successor. Also, he seems to have the same talent as him in using the sword. I do not want to see another god appear. But why? The black-robed man also looked up at the wind and snow in the sky. There was undisguised sorrow in his eyes. You ask me why? Why are you doing this? Are you doing this for your Gongsun family? Do you not just want to take revenge for Wang Jingming? Zhang Sun Qinshue's brow furrowed. She did not completely understand the other's meaning, but she could clearly sense the sorrow coming from his heart. The black-robed man did not look at her and continued to speak quietly. Between you and Zheng Xiu, Wang Jingming chose Zheng Xiu and not you. But even so, you have to take revenge for him, much less 2 people who truly love each other. What reason do I have not to take revenge for her? Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue stilled and could not help but look at each other. The black-robed man continued sorrowfully. Both the Gongsun family and my Xiao family were destroyed by Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu's cruel methods. But before that, when the Shang family started the reform, there was a Zhou family that was punished for obstructing the reform. The leaders of the Zhou family were executed and their property confiscated. Their family members were sent to Jushan Commandery. A young miss of the Zhou family was angry and worried, and fell ill along the way. At that time, I was still cultivating in Yu Mountain. When I learned of this and rushed to pick her up, she had already died of illness. Zhang Sun Qinshue's face paled slightly. She finally understood the story. My family has this mountain. I personally planted many roses in the mountain, all of the colors she liked. I waited for the flowers to bloom next year to marry her and live with her in the mountain compound. But before her favorite flowers bloomed, she was no longer there. The black-robed man slowly turned his head and looked in the direction of Chongling with great disgust. He said, "When I lost her, I think you can understand the heart-wrenching pain. My ambition for supremacy had no meaning to me at that time. In the end, the people in the family are scheming against each other, and there are not many good people. So what if they die? But she was kind and innocent. If not for the Bazin Kendo ground, if not for Wang Jingming suppressing with his sword and pushing the reform of the Shang family, how could she have died in exile? I was not by her side when she died. How much pain and helplessness did she feel? So if there is an enemy that must be killed, the first should be the Bazin Kendo ground," the black-robed man said slowly. "I followed my heart's desire and had nothing to do with anything else. After so many years, who would remember so many things of the past? Even I was only known as Yi Shao. Who would remember someone like her? But I remember." Ding Ning had been silent for a long time. When the black-robed man finished speaking, he took a deep breath and said, "Things like gratitude and grudges cannot be explained clearly. One can only follow the strongest emotions in one's heart." The black-robed man nodded. He looked down at Ding Ning. At this time, the sorrow in his eyes faded. His eyes flashed with the light of wisdom, strength, and confidence. At this time, he was no longer an ordinary person who was reminiscing about the past, but Yi Shao who controlled many of the old powers, the Emperor of the Darkness. His gaze as he looked at Ding Ning was no different from the gaze of an emperor. "I admire you," he said softly. He said softly and sincerely. "If I had not spent more than a decade acting and made Ba Mountain Sword Field trust me a bit and learned some information about the eldest miss of the Gongsun family, even I would not have been able to find where the 9-death silkworm was, and guess that you would appear here with her." The wind and snow grew thicker. The ripples of murderousness caused Zhang Sun Qinshuo to be unable to control the ripples of power of the 9 Hell King sword. With each ripple of energy, the coldness in the air grew thicker, and the falling snowflakes grew larger. The gray-black wind and snow, the pale white light of the lanterns, seemed to dye the world black and white. The Donghu monk, who had always been more silent than Ding Ning, moved slightly, reaching out to brush away the snow on his head. Talking too much was tiresome, especially for cultivators like him. After talking so much, it still depended on who could kill Ding Ning. So he looked at Yi Shao and said, "Which one of you can kill him?" The appearance of someone like Yi Shao meant that more grandmasters had silently arrived and surrounded this place. But his words were matter-of-fact. With him here, who could kill Ding Ning? He qualified to say such a thing. However, when he said this, a strange expression appeared on Sima Qiuo's face. Then he said softly and seriously, "Demon Consort Zhao is not the only one who will lead the troops. Important things need to be said more than 3 times. The animation project of the Sword Dynasty Aichi has started. The production team of the Immortal and Demon Transformation has started. The script of the Hooligan Expert has started, and the film project has started. So everyone must add my WeChat account, Wuzue in 1979. There will be many activities about the Hooligan Expert, and in the future, there will be some free activities. Wuzue 1979, quickly add me. Especially some of the suggestions will be very useful for the script and film production. Don't say it when it's finished. I will turn from a fan to an anti-fan. Search for Wuzue 1979 on WeChat, add me, and then talk. We will talk every day. Chapter 604. When he said this, the world suddenly fell silent. Even Zhang Sun Qinshuo's breathing stopped for a long moment. Demon Consort Zhao is not the only one who will personally lead the troops. The words echoed in Ding Ning's mind. He knew what the words meant, and his face paled. He looked at Sima Qiu and the guests holding lanterns on the carriages around him. At this time, he finally understood why the presence of these carriages was so strange, and why the carriage drivers and attendants, who were far from grandmasters and could not reach a terrifying level for a battle like this, had an absolutely calm presence. Because these people were the guards of the imperial palace. That presence was the so-called imperial presence that followed the emperor. So these carriages were the imperial carriages. A ripple appeared in the Donghu monk's calm mind. He sensed something and looked to the side, not far away. There, too, was a desolate hill. The emperor's attendants and carriages were already here. But the Yuanwu emperor was not here, but on the hill. In a forest on the hill, there was an ordinary stone house, but it was neatly arranged. The Yuanwu emperor, dressed in ordinary cloth robes, was drinking tea. A young palace attendant stood in front of him. She picked up the teapot on the red clay stove and made him a cup of tea. When the Donghu monk looked at the hill he was on, he had just picked up the teacup. But in the next moment, he lowered his head to take a sip. The teacup slowly landed in front of him. In the space between him and the Donghu monk, many glowing ripples appeared. His body disappeared from his spot, passed through these ripples, and appeared at the tail of the carriages. His silhouette was like an object that had suddenly appeared in a still picture, directly filling the eyes. It even gave people an uncomfortable feeling of unreality. There was a loud boom. When his body stopped moving, the air between him and the hill let out a terrifying roar, as if a very long wall had collapsed in an instant. This was a realm that was hard to understand, or rather, it was a realm that all the realm's 7 grandmasters in the world could not understand. Even the yuan qi of heaven and earth that naturally flowed from his body was like strands of dazzling divine light, making it almost impossible to look directly at his face. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes and stared deeply at the man in plain clothes who had appeared directly at the back of the convoy. He was the Yuanwu emperor of the Qin dynasty. Yuanwu's appearance had not changed at all compared to a dozen years ago. Time did not seem to have left any marks on him. Ding Ning's heart sank deeper into his body, but strangely, he did not feel any anger or other negative emotions. He had never thought that he would meet Yuanwu at this time. Zhang Sun Qinchua's fist gradually tightened. Her body was much colder than the wind and snow outside, but her palms were still sweating uncontrollably. She looked at Yuanwu, who was standing on the carriage. Yuanwu's features and figure were very ordinary. Many years ago, she felt that everything about Yuanwu was very ordinary. But a seemingly ordinary person like this had walked step by step to the peak of the world. During the Deer Mountain Conference, the grandmasters of the world had gathered. Yuanwu had many misgivings and concealed his presence. But when he flattened the mountain with one blow, his cultivation was revealed. At this time, he only needed to target the Donghu monk, her, and Ding Ning. His presence at this time was like the world was under his feet, and he looked down on all life. He glanced at the Donghu monk and said, "You are not a match for me. Why don't you work for this lonely one?" His voice was very ordinary, but very authoritative with a kind of supremacy. People could not help but feel that if he said something like this, the Donghu monk would not refute and even obey, because he was the strongest and most powerful emperor of this era. Even if he lost this great battle and lost many commanderies of land, the Qin dynasty that he owned was more than twice as vast as the other dynasties. On the mountain ridge, Yi Zhao's breathing became slightly uneven. He had not formally met Yuanwu for a long time, and Yuanwu's strength at this time created an indescribable pressure on him. But the Donghu monk shook his head. He looked at the Yuanwu emperor and said, "You are wounded." Sima Qiu was shocked. Many people in the carriage were slightly shocked. After the Deer Mountain Conference, the cultivators of many dynasties had made countless deductions and guessed that the Yuanwu emperor had been wounded in the Deer Mountain Conference. But guesses were just guesses, and were completely different from hearing this powerful Donghu monk say it. Yuanwu's eyebrows rose slightly. There was no viciousness on his calm and authoritative face. He nodded naturally. "This cannot be hidden from you, but you are still not a match for this lonely one." The Donghu monk thought, and then said, "Not necessarily." The Yuanwu emperor did not speak. He glanced at the Donghu monk from a distance. There was a soft sound in the air. His gaze seemed to become two bright swords that stabbed at the Donghu monk's face. The Donghu monk stood motionless like a tree that had withered for thousands of years. Even the wooden staff in his hand did not move. The two bright sword lights suddenly disappeared a foot in front of him. But after these two sword lights disappeared, the Donghu monk took a step forward. He raised the wooden staff in his hand, and there was a boom. There seemed to be a terrifying power in the void in front of him that collided with the wooden staff in his hand, creating a sound like a heavy and invisible bell being struck. Without any pause, his wooden staff struck back. The Yuanwu emperor on the carriage hundreds of feet away turned into a shadow, and his true body appeared behind him. The Yuanwu emperor's true body was holding a bright yellow sword, stabbing straight at the Donghu monk's back. The energy at the tip of his sword exploded, forming a crystal flower in the air, but the bright yellow light on the sword did not have time to bloom. The speed of this sword surpassed the limits of a realm 7 grandmaster's knowledge, and was as powerful as the one that killed Yin Ying at the Deer Mountain Conference. But the wooden staff in the Donghu monk's hand still had time to appear at the appropriate position and hit the blade of this sword. In this moment, it was like the Yuanwu emperor had split into two and stabbed at the Donghu monk from the front and the back. But this Donghu monk had completed two things in a flash. He had blocked the Yuanwu emperor's attack and hit the Yuanwu emperor from the back. An enormous wave of dust rose in front of and behind the Donghu monk, accompanied by tangible bright yellow light. The Yuanwu emperor's figure on the carriage and behind the Donghu monk suddenly disappeared like a dream. But then, the Yuanwu emperor's true body returned to the carriage. His brow furrowed, and his eyes flashed. In a fight like this, he was thinking of an important problem. I had not expected you to be so strong. When most of the people present had not recovered from their shock, he looked fixedly at the Donghu monk, took a deep breath and said, "You cannot be faster than this lonely one. Your speed is in directness, in turning your surroundings into your own world. In such a cramped world, you can keep up with this lonely one's speed. But you cannot have such comprehension of the sword. Even this lonely one does not have this. Only one person could use the sword like this. Then it should be because of you?" The Yuanwu emperor's gaze landed on Ding Ning. His gaze was deep and filled with probing and puzzlement. You received his 9-death silkworm method, but how can you inherit his comprehension of the sword? Ding Ning did not answer his question, but nodded solemnly at the Donghu monk in front of him. Then he reached out with his finger, and thin threads of life-bond sword energy shot out of his fingertip, leaving behind multiple light marks. Most people could not understand his actions at this time, but the few grandmasters present all stopped breathing and sensed a profound and powerful sword path. This was a sword move. The Donghu monk's dim eyes lit up. These light marks, in his perception, were a sword move that only he could comprehend at this time. This sword move, the method he cultivated, and his present state were perfect, and even had a strong restraining effect on Yuanwu's sword essence. He knew that because the Yuanwu emperor was personally leading the battle, their opponents were too strong for them. So Ding Ning could not hold back, and had to do everything possible to find a chance to win. Erosion of heaven. The Yuanwu emperor's pupils contracted. He shouted the name of this sword, but even he could only sense a part of this sword essence, and only knew the name of this sword. Some readers responded that my WeChat name would be blocked at other sites. Even reposts are so heartless. My WeChat public account is Sinless1979. Sinless Pinyin Wuzue 1979 is a number. If it is not possible, I can search for Sinless. Speaking of this, I have to condemn some pirate sites. It was fine if they pirated, but they even changed the author's name. Chapter 605. The Donghu monk did not think at all. When he comprehended this sword move, or rather, when he learned this sword move, he raised the staff in his hand and used this sword move. Previously, when the Yuanwu emperor said the Donghu monk could not win against him, this old monk said it was not certain. The most important reason was that he had received Ding Ning's guidance and comprehended some unusually powerful sword moves. So he felt that it was possible that it was because of Ding Ning. In this world, only he and Zhongsun Qinxuan knew Ding Ning's true identity, so he had absolute confidence in Ding Ning. Even so, he had not thought that Ding Ning could teach him the sword in front of the battle. This was not just familiarity with an opponent like the Yuanwu Emperor. To be able to teach him the sword in front of the battle, he had to be extremely familiar with his cultivation and physical condition. A master and disciple could not be as familiar with the sword as their own skin. Much less he had just followed Ding Ning all the way here and experienced many battles. Ding Ning could choose a sword move suitable for him to use, and was certain that he could instantly comprehend it. This kind of state surpassed all the grandmasters in the world. The staff in his hand that looked like old wood was not just the life bond item of his cultivation, but also the life bond item passed down for many years in the hands of the ascetic monks before him. It was tainted with many different powerful presences, and for a cultivator like him, it was a divine item. This sword move was extremely smooth. The tip of the staff in his hand stabbed diagonally into the sky, and there was a flickering flame at the tip of the staff. At this time, the sky was covered by the coldness of the Nine Hell King's sword. The ice and snow were angry, and the layers of black clouds were drawn over like distant mountains. As the battle just now started, Zhongsun Qinxua's murderousness grew. Large patches of gray and black, ice the size of goose feathers, fell down, heavy like tiles falling to the ground with popping sounds. But when the Donghu monk used this sword move, the layers of black clouds and heavy wind and snow were penetrated by countless lines of fire from the sky. Bright golden streams of true fire descended from the sky, clashing against the cold clouds and exploding ceaselessly. In the sky, sparks flew from thousands of trees. Many golden flames furiously absorbed the primal energies of the universe, like seal scripts on seal weapons. When they passed through the cold clouds, they turned into thin golden swords with a bone-corroding smell. For any cultivator, as long as a sword fragment like this entered their body, then their flesh and bones would immediately be corroded, turning into nothingness. Thousands of swords shot toward the Yuanwu Emperor from all directions. This scene was like a miracle. This sword essence was not unfamiliar to the Yuanwu Emperor. It had once appeared in Chongling, in the battle where the experts of the world had gathered to kill Wang Jingming. Wang Jingming had once used this sword to kill many cultivators. Even though he had reached Realm 8, he did not dare to be careless. The bright yellow sword in his hand slashed upwards. Countless strands of light that were even more dazzling than the golden true fire, bringing with them a vast and holy aura, bloomed from his sword. These dazzling rays of light formed a huge phoenix around his body, a legendary divine beast. But in the next moment, the vast energy belonging to Realm 8 burst out of his body. The sword phoenix image was shattered by his own power, and then turned into even finer sword threads and bright light. These forces caused the sky to tremble, as if a godly mountain of Sumeru was being propped up. Zhongsun Qinxua's eyes flashed violently. Her right hand uncontrollably flowed blue-black life bond energy. The Nine Hell King sword automatically formed and slowly appeared in her hand. Ever since the Deer Mountain Conference, she knew that Yuanwu was not the Yuanwu she was familiar with. But now, seeing him fight, she still felt disbelief. In this moment, Yuanwu used his life bond sword to create the sword phoenix, and then used his body to create the great Sumeru sword of the Bazin Kendo ground. These two swords in Yuanwu's hands became a new sword move, a sword move that was invincible in defense. Sea of Bitterness Crossing. When the Donghu monk had used the erosion of heaven that he had just comprehended, Ding Ning had already shouted. Then he used his right hand as a sword and made another sword move. Sea of Bitterness Crossing was a secret sword of the Donghu monk sect and seemed to be engraved in his life. Hearing Ding Ning shout, the Donghu monk allowed his body's intuition to make this move. A gray staff shadow cut through the wind and waves like the sails of an enormous ship, passing through the invisible divine mountain and heading towards Yuanwu. Then the Donghu monk used the third move, the one that Ding Ning had used with his fingers as a sword. This was a new sword move. As the surrounding air flowed, this sword move seemed to flow naturally into the Donghu monk's mind. The staff in the Donghu monk's hand shook again. The three swords were executed in a smooth and fluid manner. There was an extremely strange explosion. A white shockwave exploded above the Yuanwu Emperor's head, and a hole seemed to appear in the air. The Donghu monk's staff became blurry, but in the center of the white shockwave, there was a clear staff tip stabbing towards his head. Other than Ding Ning and the Donghu monk, everyone's expression changed. The Yuanwu Emperor's body produced multiple heads and multiple pairs of arms. Such a scene was because the Yuanwu Emperor was moving too quickly, exceeding what the eyes and senses of the cultivators present could capture. There was an explosion. A golden flame shattered the scene that appeared in everyone's eyes. A muffled groan was heard. The Yuanwu Emperor's figure retreated from the golden flame. A faint line of blood flowed down his forehead. Cries of astonishment rang out. The Grand Masters present were certain that the Yuanwu Emperor had not been seriously injured, but under the Donghu monk's three moves, he did not have the advantage and was bleeding. No birth and death. Before these shocked gasps sounded, Ding Ning's voice sounded by the Donghu monk's ears. Ding Ning's expression was unusually solemn. There seemed to be stars flashing in his eyes. Every time they flashed, it represented a thought flashing through his sea of consciousness. At this time, he was using the Donghu monk's hand to attack. The Donghu monk was close to breaking through to Realm 8, and his energy was at the most perfect time of his life. Yuanwu's injuries in the Deer Mountain Conference were more serious than the outside world had speculated. But this did not mean that he could win or escape today's situation. Actually, what affected Yuanwu the most right now was Yuanwu's own state of mind. It was the shock he felt when he saw him use these sword moves. The more he showed these sword moves without holding back, the more it shocked Yuanwu, and the more Yuanwu could not concentrate. So when he shouted the name of the Donghu monk's no birth and death sword move, Ding Ning attacked again. The sword light of his life bond sword appeared in his hand. An extremely simple and upright sword essence pierced forward. However, this sword essence was perfect to the extreme. It was so perfect that all the sword masters present felt that it was unattainable. The Donghu monk was slightly puzzled. This was just an army breaker sword move from the Bazinkindo ground without any fancy moves. Anyone could learn such a sword move, and the simpler the sword essence, the more talent one needed to make it perfect, and had nothing to do with hard work. The power of this sword was not great. Could it be that it could achieve an unexpected effect? He did not understand, but at this time, he sensed the shock of the Yuanwu Emperor's mind. Between him and a cultivator of the Yuanwu Emperor's level, there was a telepathic connection. He could instinctively feel that the Yuanwu Emperor's presence was showing a flaw. The Donghu monk immediately understood. Only Wang Jingming of the past could display such a perfect sword essence. But now, such a sword essence had reappeared. How could people not be shocked? This sword was not for him to use, but to give him a chance. The staff in his hand disappeared. His no birth and death meant no birth and death. There was nothing in the world that would appear for no reason, and no matter would disappear. No birth and no destruction, no increase and no decrease. The staff that disappeared from his hand appeared directly in front of the Yuanwu Emperor's chest. The primal energies of the universe in front of the Yuanwu Emperor's chest were in his hand, turning into a transparent sword. Chapter 606. The Yuanwu Emperor's sea of consciousness rippled. His mind was shocked. Ding Ning's perfect sword essence had no intention of imitating it. In his perception, it was that person in the past who had used such a sword in battle. A strong emotion was pulled out from the bottom of his heart. The strongest emotion was a deep sense of fear. What had kept him and Zheng Xiu together all these years, and made him tolerate everything Zheng Xiu did, was not because of his burning love for Zheng Xiu, but because of the terror of the 9-death silkworm and the stone-grinding sword reappearing. He knew more than anyone how terrifying that person was, especially when that person had turned the battle into a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood in the last battle in Chongling. He had seen the entire process from a distance. Compared to the experts that person had killed in the past, he was not outstanding. He was even certain that if that person had not killed so many top experts, he might not have been the first to cross Realm 7 and enter Realm 8 in the world. So he was not just worried about that person and the Bazinkindo grounds deeds being spread and burning the history books, but more because of his terror of that person. So he was not willing to hear that person's name and remember that person's power. That person's power had accompanied him throughout his life, from a threatened imperial son to the strongest emperor in the world. This kind of terror was a part of his body, coming from the depths of his soul, and he could not control it. His energy was shaken and could not stop the Donghu monk's staff from reaching him. But he was the only Realm 8 expert in the world, and knew the energy rules that Realm 7s could not understand. When the power of the staff was about to shatter his body through the air, a dot of light appeared on his forehead. A unique energy in his body turned into a beam of light, shooting into the sky and immediately causing the energy in the sky to react. A vast energy came down from the sky. This energy was above the air. In the words of the cultivation world, it was beyond this world and came from the stars. Ordinary cultivators could not sense and communicate with the power of the stars. Because the mental power of cultivators was limited, they could not clearly sense the energy rules in the stars so high up. So ordinary cultivators called the energy outside the world cold energy and could not use it. Only a few people, like Zheng Xiao, had unique methods that could reflect a corner of the stars like a mirror, and from there comprehend some of the energy rules and use the energy power. But it was different in Realm 8. In the records of the cultivation world, Realm 8 could break through this limit. While they could not peer into a corner of the starry sky like those methods, they could instantly absorb terrifying energies for their own use from the boundary where the world and the starry sky intersected. This level was like opening another world. So Realm 7 was called Mountain Moving, and Realm 8 was called Heaven Opening. When Yuanwu used this kind of power, the scene in everyone's eyes was like the opening of the heavens. An enormous silver ray of light came down from the sky that no one could see and landed on the staff that was attacking his chest. In the vast silver light, the staff was as minuscule as a cow's hair. The strange astral origin chi that the cultivators of this world were familiar with was completely different from the astral origin chi that bound the staff within. The floating staff floated within the silvery light, as though it was being refined unceasingly, emitting purplish-red smoke. He saw that the tip of the staff was just a few feet away from Yuanwu's body, but could not touch him. Even the energy of this divine item was being destroyed and was gradually leaving his control. But the Donghu monk's face did not change at all like the dry bark of a tree. This staff was only half of the power in his attack, and the other half was in his hand. The ground under him caved in, and his figure turned into a faint shadow in the air. He held this transparent long sword, and in this moment came next to Yuanwu and stabbed at Yuanwu's energy sea. Yi Xiao and Sima Qiu changed expressions at the same time. They could not imagine how this attack could be resolved. Sometimes victory and defeat did not depend on the level of cultivation, but time. Yuanwu's previous emotional fluctuations had been too great. Now this attack was the time he could not attend to. They did not even dare to think, if the Yuanwu emperor died here, what would happen to the world? But at this time, the Donghu monk whose cultivation was second only to Yuanwu sensed something before them and raised his head slightly. A white line of fire was falling from the sky. This was a star fire. The star fire was filled with a powerful and cold sword essence. There was a soft sound. The Donghu monk let go of this transparent long sword and returned to his original position. A pale white dot of light appeared on the transparent long sword, and then it was penetrated by the star fire, burning fiercely. Then there was an enormous boom. There was another violent explosion in front of Yuanwu, and the ground within 100 feet was blown to powder. Yuanwu retreated another 100 feet. There were no wounds on his body, but his face was paler. Zhang Sun Qinxue, took a deep breath. That star fire naturally came from Zhengxiu. Every time she saw a star fire like this, she could not control her anger. In this moment, she faintly hoped that the star fire would land on Yuanwu. But this adulterous couple in her eyes had the same terror, and this sword had blocked the Donghu monk's victorious attack. A hint of bitterness appeared at the corners of Ding Ning's mouth. No matter how many steps the Yuanwu Emperor retreated, no matter how much he was wounded, as long as the Yuanwu Emperor was alive, he was still the strongest existence here. They could not escape the shadow of death. And he knew, starting from this moment, their situation would become even more difficult. Yuanwu could take a wrong step, but if they took a wrong step, what awaited them was only death. Because at this time, Sima Qiu, Yi Xiao and the others were sure that Yuanwu alone could not resolve this battle. The wild wind howled, accompanied by pure white ice and snow. The Grandmaster who had appeared with Yi Xiao had attacked first. This Grandmaster did not have any reputation in Chongling, and even Ding Ning did not know his origins. But what he cultivated was an extremely cold sword essence, and Ding Ning even sensed the presence of Min Mountain Sword Snow. That kind of coldness could not compare to the coldness of the Nine Hell King's sword, but the sharpness surpassed it. When the Grandmaster drew his sword with a solemn expression, thousands of white ice swords appeared in the air in front of him the moment he swung his flawless white sword. These ice swords, together with the great power released by his life-bond sword, formed an enormous snow-white sword dragon. It danced wildly in the air and bit towards Zhangsun Qinshui. In the sky above the snow-white sword dragon, there was a black shadow. Yi Zhao's figure disappeared, but a black crescent moon fell from the sky with a terrifying murderousness. Sima Qiu naturally would not give up on such an excellent opportunity to attack. A low shout came from his mouth. The seemingly soft and feminine yuan qi on his body exploded with the most ferocious and violent power. A broad and broken gray broadsword appeared in his hand. The sword moved with blade essence, and vast amounts of primal energies of the universe were forced to form a glowing wall of blades that slashed towards Zhangsun Qinshui. No Realm 7 could withstand the combined attack of 3 experts. Even the Donghu monk might not be able to do so. Zhangsun Qinshui knew she could not. Her body unconsciously moved towards Ding Ning, wanting to be closer at this moment. Dread demon, first kill this Min Mountain Sword Snow. But Ding Ning's cold voice reached the ears of the Donghu monk and her. Dread demon was a killing move that the Donghu monk cultivated. Without the need for words, the Donghu monk sensed it. His hands reached towards the sky in front of him. That staff that was trembling in the silver pillar of light started to spin furiously. With golden light, it left the shackles of the silver pillar of light and smashed towards the Yuanwu Emperor. Ding Ning did not know the name of the cultivator who had used the snow-white sword dragon, but when he said Min Mountain Sword Snow to Zhangsun Qinshui stopped thinking. The Nine Hell King sword disappeared from her hand, turning into gray crystals. Zhangsun Qinshui and Ding Ning had lived in seclusion together in Chongling for many years. Most of the time, she did not want to think, and had absolute trust in Ding Ning. At this time, she did not care about the killing moves of Yi Xiao and Sima Qiu. All her power surged towards that cultivator. The gray crystals passed through the air and collided with the thousands of white swords. In a flash, countless snowy white flowers exploded. That unknown cultivator's expression changed in shock. Countless snow-white flowers formed an enormous white flower tree in front of him, but those gray-black crystals had already been thrown out, piling up into swords again. This cultivator's eyes were filled with terror. He could not believe that he was unable to stop the other's attack, even though they both cultivated cold sword essences. Even more importantly, he did not dare to believe that Zhangsun Qinshui had ignored the other 2 killing intents and put all of her power into this one blow. With a puff, the Nine Hell King's sword pierced his chest. At this moment, the Nine Hell King's sword turned back into countless grayish-black ice crystals and shot out of his body. His body instantly disintegrated, turning into countless ice shards that shot out. This powerful Grandmaster disappeared from the world. But at the same time, the black crescent moon and the wall-like crystal blade were falling towards Zhongsun Qinxue. This was the time she could not counterattack or defend. She waited silently and looked at Ding Ning. Ding Ning stood silently at his spot and attacked. Chapter 607. His demeanor was very calm and somewhat focused, but he gave off the feeling that he was very experienced. The moment he attacked, his life-bond sword formed in his hand. His posture gave people the feeling that he had practiced countless times and finally grasped the essence. It became an instinct in life. No sword move had to follow a path. Just like how some artists could copy any fine line of a masterpiece, even if it was the same, they could not copy the essence of the master. The sword moves were the same, but the person was different. Each person's vital energy was different, and even the swords in their hands were different. In the end, what they pursued was perfect compatibility. Therefore, the strongest and most perfect sword essence was the sword move, the cultivator himself, the sword in his hand, his mind, and the entire world at this time. Each sword had this state, but even the simplest sword moves could not be perfectly executed by most swordsmen in the world. At this moment, Ding Ning's sword strike made everyone feel that it was perfect to the extreme. It was impossible to even imagine a more perfect state. The natal sword in his hand released a heart-palpitating aura. The sword light spun around his body like a millstone. The 9 death silkworms in his body had awakened. His body disappeared in the pale white flows in this moment. Other than Zhongsun Qinxue and the Donghu monk, everyone was terrified. Other than the 9 death silkworm, there was also this stone-grinding sword. This was Wang Jingming's unique stone-grinding sword. Even more importantly, other than Wang Jingming of the past, there was someone else who could perfectly use the stone-grinding sword in front of them. If even a sword move like this could be used perfectly, then what about Wang Jingming's other sword moves? The Yuanwu Emperor suddenly felt cold, even bone-chilling. The Black Moon and the Crystal Blade had not met the stone-grinding sword essence, but with Ding Ning's attack, he knew the result of their encounter. But he could not interfere now. The staff, which was emitting a dazzling golden light, arrived in front of him like the legendary demon-subduing pestle. His bones began to crack under the immense pressure. He could only retreat again. Footprints were left on the ground, and then the ground exploded one after another, like huge mud lotuses blooming. The sky opened up again, and a huge silver beam of light landed on the staff. Time seemed to have stopped, but the area within a radius of 1,000 feet suddenly darkened, as if all the light had been swallowed up. The Donghu monk and the Yuanwu emperor grunted at the same time. Their bodies only showed signs of weakness now. The Black Moon and the Crystal Knife met with the sword light outside Ding Ning's body. Countless sparks burst out from the rotating sword light, as if countless stars were constantly disappearing. Ding Ning's body emitted a strange sound that sounded like bubbles bursting. This was the result of the chaotic collisions between the vital essence and qi and blood in his body. They were like countless fine flowers blooming in his body, tearing at his flesh and meridians at the same time. His sword light had shattered the Black Moon and the Crystal Knife, but countless tiny forces still cut his body, instantly causing many small wounds to appear on his body. However, he was still alive. He fought 1 against 2, and used this sword to block Yi Xiao and Sima Qiuo's attacks. Sima Qiuo, Ding Ning said to Zhongsun Qinxue. Of course, this was not a sword move, but a direction to attack. Even though Zhongsun Qinxue had just killed a powerful cultivator who might be related to Min Mountain Sword Sect, Ding Ning knew she had such ability. The 9 Hell King sword was still above the powerful cultivator who had been killed and had not completely formed. But a gray streak of snow had broken through the wind. Following Zhongsun Qinxue's gaze, it landed on Sima Qiuo's eyes like it was alive. Sima Qiuo shouted. He made a simple slash and slap. This simple move was not beautiful, but it was very practical. The gray streak of snow was cut in 2, the power unable to continue, and then it was slapped apart. There was a loud boom, The gray streak of snow was just a faint line, but when it was slapped apart, it was like a snowy mountain was collapsing. The world in front of him was covered in flying snow. The broad short sword in Sima Qiuo's hand trembled. His expression was ugly. He could not imagine that the eldest miss of the Gongsun family in the past had such power. But at this time, all the hair on his body stood on end. A strong threat of death caused him to scream like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, and jump up. A thin golden light flew out of the shadow behind him and landed on his back. This was a small golden lotus, completely flawless, like it was formed from the purest sunlight. At the same time, Zhongsun Qinshua's eyebrows lit up with a golden flame, like the pure golden flower yellow that many rich girls would put on. As he screamed, the power accumulated in Sima Qiuo's body surged out. Vital energy and primal energies of the universe filled every inch of his meridians and flesh, causing his body to swell. There seemed to be a more real Sima Qiuo charging out of his body to avoid that tiny golden light. The power that poured out of his body gathered the primal qi of the universe that fell down like a mountain, forming countless crisscrossing gray sword energies. They exuded a strong sense of decay, like a cage made of countless withered bones. In the next moment, it was like two invisible ships collided in front of Sima Qiuo. The terrifying wave of energy threw his body even higher into the air. Pew 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 pew. Multiple springs of blood appeared on his body, spraying in the wild wind. His body quickly shrank like a leaking balloon. Even the left side of his face had a terrifying bone-deep wound. Even half of his ear had disappeared. But Sima Qiuo only rejoiced inside. He rejoiced that he was still alive. It was not just that the opponent's strength far surpassed his imagination, but that after more than a decade, he had forgotten some things that he should not have forgotten. He had forgotten that the other was not just the master of the Nine Hell King's sword, but also the only heir of the Gongsun family. The Gongsun family, the former number one of the old nobility, not only had power, but also some powerful cultivation methods and secret arts. For example, this heart lotus that no one knew whether it should be described as a seal weapon, a sword, or some other means to fight against enemies. Yi Zhao's figure also appeared in the air. He stepped down from the mountain peak, and his life-bond sword appeared in his hand. He was as mysterious as his life-bond sword. Only now did the cultivator's presence see that his life-bond sword was a deep black like the eternal night. But the black blade was made from 9 intertwining scaled swords. These 9 black scaled swords were like 9 black poisonous snakes. The life-bond sword fell faster than his body. It flew in front of him and split into 9 in the air. These 9 flying swords flew in different trajectories in the air and strangely fell towards Zhongsun Qinshuo from all directions. A cultivator could not divide their attention to control 2 flying swords at the same time. But this leader of the old nobility did not know how to use a secret art to split one sword into 9. Accompanying these 9 swords were numerous other strong, murderous intents. Sima Qiuo was not the only Realm 7 in this train of carriages. Zhongsun Qinshuo could not stop these 9 swords, much less the murderous intents of the Grandmasters. But she and the old monk beside Ding Ning could. He had some leisure right now. Numerous staff shadows appeared in the air. Bam, 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 bam. Yi Zhao's 9 swords and the sword essences of the Grandmasters were all repelled and blocked. In this moment, the old monk's attack was almost perfect. At least, in the few feet of space around him, his speed was perfect. In the past, no cultivator in the world could believe that a Realm 7 cultivator could block the attacks of Realm 7 cultivators like he had 3 heads and 6 arms. But at this time, Yuan Wu had the leisure. How could Yuan Wu's attack be defeated? Go! Ding Ning knew this. His body was covered in wounds. There was no blood, but his face was extremely pale. But at this time, there was no terror in his eyes. Instead, there was a viciousness he did not usually have. With a shout, he gripped Zhongsun Qinshuo's hand and charged towards the group of carriages. He was seriously wounded and was too weak compared to the Realm 7s around him. Even so, he appeared slow. But even more importantly, Zhang Sun Qinxuan knew his intentions. Her power and speed far surpassed all the realm sevens in the group of carriages, including Yi Xiao, who was falling from the sky. Her and Ding Ning's bodies immediately faded, and then accelerated terrifyingly in the air, leaving behind a long, blurry shadow. With a boom, the carriage that Sima Qiu had been standing on was shattered by the power of her and Ding Ning's arrival. There were two cultivators in the shattered carriage. One of the young people had fallen to the ground when the carriage shattered and vomited blood. The other cultivator's sleeves danced wildly, and a sword light stabbed toward Zhang Sun Qinshue's heart meridian. There was a soft sound. What was pierced was not Zhang Sun Qinshue's heart meridian, but the heart meridian of this cultivator. The Donghu monk's figure appeared next to Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinshu. His hand was straight, and so was the staff, piercing through the heart meridian of that cultivator. The Yuanwu Emperor had steadied himself. But at this time, the Donghu monk had killed an expert, but he still had not acted. Gasps sounded in the carriage, but no killing intent fell towards Zhang Sun Qinshue and Ding Ning. The reason naturally came from the young person in the carriage. Chapter 608. Shock, awe, terror, disbelief. Many extreme emotions shrouded most of the people on the train. From a certain point of view, the lives of all the people on the train were not as important as this young person in the carriage. This young person was Imperial Prince Fu Su, the future successor of the Qin dynasty. Only now did many of them realize why Ding Ning, Zhang Sun Qinshue, and the others had to deal with Sima Qiu first. Sima Qiu was like Fu Su's guard. But to be able to kidnap Fu Su while so many grandmasters were working together was a miracle. When the world was completely silent, and even the wind and snow became soft due to Zhang Sun Qinshue's exhaustion, all these cultivators felt cold when they thought of the perfect sword essences just now. Looking at the masked Ding Ning, they seemed to see that person from the past. But at this time, Ding Ning was even stronger and younger than that person when he first walked into the streets of Chongling. Back then, that person's sword intent had only reached great success after fighting against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, reaching such a perfect level. But now his successor was so young, but his sword intent actually seemed to surpass his own. Many of the people in the chariot held high positions. Originally, in their hearts, even if that person really left behind a successor, it would only be a symbolic and summoning significance. That person's successor might cause some rebels to reconsider. However, at this moment, they clearly realized that the other party was no longer just a symbolic figure. Instead, he had grown into a terrifying existence. Numerous pieces of black snow fell on Fu Su's body. Fu Su's body suddenly froze. A thin layer of ice appeared on the surface of his body. His vital energy could not flow through his body, and he could not even move his tongue. Ding Ning coughed softly, spitting out some small blood clots. Then he looked up at the Yuanwu Emperor. Time seemed to pass very slowly at this time. Everyone was waiting for the Yuanwu Emperor's decision. Yet, the Yuanwu Emperor was silent for a long time. This made people feel suffocated. When Wang Jingming just entered Chongling and was fighting with some gangsters, this lonely one coincidentally met him. When he finally spoke, many people's hearts were suddenly shaken. Before this, when the Yuanwu Emperor mentioned Wang Jingming, he only used that person, but this time he mentioned Wang Jingming's name. Therefore, I actually know everything about him better than anyone else. His talent, his cultivation methods, and his comprehension of various sword manuals. Emperor Yuanwu looked deeply at Ding Ning's features. His tone was still calm, but his expression became slightly strange. His talent is naturally very good, and he is the best in the world. But after that, everyone in the world felt that he was invincible because of his natural talent. This is a mistake. Because I know that other than his talent, he is unusually hard-working in his cultivation. For things like duels, if one is far stronger than the opponent and comes every few days, it is like leisure. While relaxing, one can enjoy countless cheers and admiring gazes and gain fame in Chongling. But if one duels every few days, This is a tiring matter, especially when one does not have absolute confidence. The Yuanwu emperor was silent for a moment and then said, "When one is not confident, one needs to study the other's cultivation methods and weaknesses. One also needs to spend great effort to find a way to win." He used this method to force himself. Many times, in order to study a sword move, he would not rest for many days. Sometimes, in order to practice an ordinary sword move, who knows how many times he would have to practice it in a day. It is precisely because I understand his path of cultivation and how he grows that I am even more certain that even if someone can surpass him in talent, it is impossible for them to work several times harder than him. As a result, it is impossible for anyone in the world to comprehend the way of the sword much faster than him. The Yuanwu emperor took a deep breath. He looked at Ding Ning, who was listening silently, and said, "Even if you started cultivating from birth, at such an age, you have already walked his entire life's path. Your attainments in the sword are multiple times greater than when he died in battle. Methods and sword manuals can be passed down, but attainments and comprehension of the sword path, the sword sense that requires countless practice, cannot be passed down. So you shouldn't just be his successor. You should be his rebirth." When the Yuanwu emperor's words sounded, an uncontrollable wave of gasps and gasps sounded like a tsunami. The endless shock and disbelief caused many people in the carriage to be as stiff as Fu Su. If someone attacked with a sword right now, many of them would be killed by cultivators several realms below them because they were too agitated. Such words were too shocking. Ding Ning frowned deeply. He looked directly at the Yuanwu emperor's gaze and said with slight disdain, "Is there such a thing as rebirth in the world?" The Yuanwu emperor said coldly, "Maybe this is another way of living." Before Ding Ning spoke again, his gaze landed on Zhang Sun Qinxue and the Donghu monk. He said, "Their emotions cannot be disguised. Even this lonely one's words are like this. This means this lonely one's speculation is correct. For this lonely one, no matter what method of rebirth it is, even if it is just a matter of the 9-death silkworm method, you have inherited all of his memories, cultivation experience, and comprehension of cultivation. Then you are his rebirth. The method is different, but the result is the same." Countless people in the field held their breaths. Other than the sound of the wind and snow, even the heartbeats of many people were so clear. Many people could not help but think, if this speculation was true, and the news spread, what kind of shock would it cause in the world? Ding Ning did not admit or deny it. He looked at the Yuanwu emperor and sneered. "Why are you saying so much?" He sneered and continued, "You've said so much and made such a deduction, not for me to hear, but for Zheng Xiu to hear. You just want to deduce a reason why you must kill me now. Only such a reason. Even if Fu Su is sacrificed, she can bear it. So, what you need now is a reason to sacrifice Fu Su," Ding Ning said slowly, emphasizing each word. Above the wind and snow, an enormous sound came from the sky. It was like thunder breaking through the sky. The Yuanwu emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and pressed his lips together. Even when you become the emperor of the Qin dynasty, you still need to borrow her power, still have to endure her, still fear angering her and breaking off relations. Ding Ning's expression was even calmer. He looked coolly at him and asked, "Then have you ever thought, if I am really like you say, his rebirth, and even more than you think, then you are facing me now? How do you feel?" "Yuanwu, you are so good at enduring." The Yuanwu emperor's lips curled slightly, as though he was proud, but he started to tremble slightly. He raised his head, looked into the distance, and did not make any more sound. But the roars in the sky grew louder. Everyone present knew that his decision could not be changed. His killing intent was set. This was a very important chapter for the entire book. Yes, the book of the Sword Dynasty was like this. Each chapter was written to shock oneself. Then there will be more discussions. Add me on WeChat, search for Innocent, or search for Wuzue 1979. There will be interactions every day. There will be regular gifts. Chapter 609. But Ding Ning did not stop. From a certain point of view, He was the sect master of the Bazin Kindo ground, the symbol of the Bazin Kindo ground. Especially when the Yuanwu emperor guessed that he was Wang Jingming's reborn and not his heir. In the eyes of everyone present, Ding Ning was not much different from Wang Jingming in the past. Back then, countless grandmasters had gathered in Chongling to kill Wang Jingming. But if Wang Jingming spoke, all the grandmasters would listen. This was enough weight. Also, Ding Ning had the 9-death silkworm and the secret of why he had such a perfect sword essence. So no one acted. Everyone listened to his words. Even a vicious tiger will not eat its cubs. Yuanwu, today, you want Fu Su to die with us because you do not want to lose a chance to kill us. Using a son to exchange for such a chance. This is how you were different from the people of the Bazin Kindo ground back then. There are things to do and things not to do. Unscrupulous means can let you gain temporary benefits, but to conquer the world, do you just rely on cultivation? Ding Ning looked at Yuanwu, his disdain growing. The Qin and Chu war is so dangerous that even you are going personally, but you have Fu Su stay here with Sima Qiu. Maybe you wanted to use this chance to kill your son? Everyone present was suppressing their emotions and breathing. But when they heard Ding Ning's words, even though everyone was trying to control themselves, countless gasps gathered together and sounded clearly. Not long ago, the Qin palace had forced out a hidden palace attendant. She was the powerful grandmaster of the Bazin Kindo ground in the past, demon consort Zhao's master. But that matter caused all the Qin people to guess whose son Fu Su was. Fu Su was naturally this lonely one's flesh and blood. Yuanwu seemed to hear everyone's thoughts. His voice still sounded calmly with suffocating majesty and energy vibrations. It was not this lonely one's idea to send him to the front lines to train. What is the use in saying these words? Ding Ning had difficulty breathing, but he still smiled and said, "If you are not truly worried, why respond to me now? Especially when you did not want to speak just now, but now you say this. I think you know very well that while Zheng Xiu sent him here, she did not send him here for you to kill." After a pause, he looked provocatively at Yuanwu and said with slight disdain, "Maybe she purposefully sent him here to see your intentions, to see if you suspect this son. I am not an ordinary person, so why should I be considered ordinary?" Yuanwu looked calmly and coldly at Ding Ning. He slowly said, "This is the country. For an unprecedented Qin dynasty, even if this lonely one must sacrifice today, this lonely one will make the same choice. This is your so-called righteousness?" Ding Ning smiled and said, "But I am not saying these words to argue with you. I also do not want to say that you are heartless and have no face to talk about righteousness. I am having you say these words, not because I want to hear them, but so you can say them for others to hear. Do you remember what I said to you about when there is no other way?" Ding Ning's last words were directed at Zhang Sun Qinshuan next to him. When he spoke, he was no longer looking at Yuanwu, but at Zhang Sun Qinshuan. When he spoke, Yuanwu suddenly sensed something. This feeling was indescribably strange. He inexplicably felt that the other had a chance of escaping. He could not help but give a low roar. Accompanied by this roar that did not seem to come from him, many bright paths of light appeared on the surface of his body. The light came from the meridians in his body. In this moment, the power in his body seemed to turn into bright rays of light that Realm 7 could not understand, and came out of his body at a terrifying speed. In this moment, his body did not seem like a person's body, but a seal weapon. Countless booms rang out high up in the sky, as if countless gods and demons were roaring in response. The sky that was covered by the wind and snow was torn into pieces, and countless huge pillars of light descended like divine punishment. When the scorching sun at noon in summer was at its fiercest, being too bright would give people a feeling of whiteness. However, at this moment, it was so bright that everyone seemed to have become transparent. Apart from the bright white in their eyes, there was no other trace of shadow. There was no sense of sword essence. This kind of blinding light did not even allow people to sense killing intent. But not being able to sense it was the greatest danger. In the last breath, Zhang Sun Qinshuan had gripped the Nine-Hell King sword in her hand. Before Ding Ning discovered the great punishment sword, the Nine-Hell King sword was recognized as the strongest and most vicious sword in the world. This was the symbol of the Gongsun family, the former most powerful family in Chongling. Yet the Gongsun family had sealed this sword for many years and did not dare to touch it because it was too strong and no one could subdue it. Zhongsun Qinxue had hidden in Chongling and cultivated this sword into her life-bond sword at all costs. This sword had once been her only hope for revenge. In the dead of night, in Falling Parasol, Ding Ning and she had discussed plans for revenge many times. Revenge, the key was to survive before killing the enemy. So Ding Ning had repeatedly mentioned something. If he and Zhongsun Qinxue were exposed and could not escape Chongling according to the escape route he had drawn on the wall and were trapped in Chongling, then there was no other way. Now was the time that Ding Ning had repeatedly mentioned. Zhongsun Qinxue gripped the sword. She did not move and just pushed all of her vital energy and energy into the sword. The extremely deep luster on the sword faded. The accumulated coldness inside the Nine-Hell King sword that had accumulated for many years was forced out by Zhongsun Qinxue. The Nine-Hell King sword in her hand became transparent, like the purest crystal sword. With a boom, the netherworld appeared. When the extreme light fell from the sky, the netherworld rose from the ground. It was a patch of darkness filled with the coldness of death. The battle between light and darkness only lasted for a moment. Then the two sides exploded at the point of contact. At the beginning, there was no sound. There were only white flames dancing in the sky and the shattered coldness of death. The water vapor in the air turned to ice. The sunlight that could freely pass through this world twisted and blurred, illuminating the scenery of the carriages. There were ice sculptures everywhere in the carriages. Almost all the cultivators below Realm 6 were not simply frozen, but completely frozen. They died, their flesh and blood turning black. Under the impact of the white flames and ice, the corpses of these cultivators exploded like glass, scattering on the ground and even igniting crystal dust. Yi Shao stood among the ice shards on the ground. There were two sword essences on his two sides that slowly disappeared like enormous black wings. This kind of coldness and the collision of Realm 8 power did not pose any threat to him, but it blocked his perception. At this time, Ding Ning and the others were no longer in his sight and perception. But he knew that this could not end like this, so he turned slightly to look at Yuanwu. Yuanwu nodded at him and said coldly, "They cannot escape." The Donghu monk's hands were together. Energy flowed out of the two ends of the staff, binding the bodies of Ding Ning, Zhongsun Qinxue, and Fu Su. He seemed to be using this staff to carry the three of them as he walked quickly. In the battle just now, he didn't have any obvious injuries on his body, but now there were many sparkling cracks on his back and legs. Even his body could not bear it when he took that moment to escape Yuanwu's control. His tendons and muscles that were stronger than metal and stone cracked in many places. "I will not be able to act for a day and night." Ding Ning swallowed hard and said to the Donghu monk. The Donghu monk nodded to show he understood. He could not see through the nine-death silkworm. As to Zhongsun Qinxue, even her life-bond energy was used up. In the following long time, Zhongsun Qinxue was no different from an ordinary person. "We must keep walking," Ding Ning continued. "His last attack was not just a killing blow, but to prevent us from escaping. We have his energy imprinted on us." The Donghu monk situation was not optimistic, but he still nodded. He followed Ding Ning's gaze and said, "I understand." Chapter 610. The Donghu monk's body that looked like it would shatter into pieces at any moment seemed to have endless energy. He carried the three of them on his shoulders and traveled at a terrifying speed through the wasteland at the border of the Qin and Chu kingdom. He didn't know how far he had traveled, but he didn't stop until the sky gradually darkened. This should be the end of the Yin mountain range that reached into the Chu. What flowed through the mountains was a stream formed from melted glaciers. It was bone-chilling. It was spring in the wilderness on the battlefield, but winter had not yet passed in this shady place in the mountains. Ding Ning scooped up a handful of water. This kind of melted glaciers had a unique light blue color that came from the contamination of some ores in the mountain rocks. The clear and cold water flowed into his body, cooling his boiling hot body slightly. His body had an abnormal heat. One came from his injuries and weakness, and the other came from Yuan Wu's last rampaging energy. Those rays of energy that did not belong to this world remained in his body, burning slowly and stopping his wounds from healing. Even more importantly, this invisible energy that did not belong to this world could not be consumed and cleansed by the 9-death silkworm. The Donghu monk could not hold on any longer. He started to breathe and quickly entered meditation to replenish his vital energy. Ding Ning glanced at Fu Su next to him. He regulated his breathing and said softly, "Since you can move, you can drink some water and treat your wounds. This place is not like Chongling. If your wounds worsen, even if you do not die, I fear you will have many hidden injuries that will be detrimental to your future cultivation. But you do not have to think about taking the opportunity to attack anyone here, because this is something you cannot do." Fu Su's wounds came mainly from the cold energy contained in Zhang Sun Qinshue's attack, and not from the impact. His organs had only shifted slightly in the previous shock. This was not a serious injury for cultivators, but the coldness contained in Zhang Sun Qinshue's life bond energy was like many impenetrable ice needles piercing his organs and meridians. These ice needles caused his organs to be unable to harmonize. If one was unable to adjust, then it would be chaotic. If one was chaotic and unable to adjust themselves, then the cultivator's body would completely collapse. The layer of ice that had restrained him previously came from Zhang Sun Qinshue's power. At this moment, Zhang Sun Qinshuе had entered a deep sleep-like healing process. The ice that restrained him slowly disappeared. Fu Su could indeed move now. Just as Ding Ning had said, he continued to pretend that his body was stiff, waiting for an opportunity to attack. After being exposed by Ding Ning, Fu Su was not terrified. He was silent for a moment and asked, "Why did you not flee towards the Chu dynasty army, and instead chose this escape route?" Ding Ning explained calmly, "You should have heard your father say that the final goal of this battle is not to attack the Chu, not to weaken the Chu dynasty and destroy it, but to confirm my existence, force me out, and kill me. If you kill me, you'll be able to completely destroy the Bazin Kendo ground and the hope of many rebels in the Qin dynasty." So from the moment he appeared, this was the only goal of this battle. Since he and Zheng Xiu had set up such a trap, then while the Qin dynasty army will definitely lose, at least there is a possibility of fighting and retreating. But all the powerful cultivators in the army will leave the army to chase after me. These powerful cultivators will leave the army and become the trackers and assassins in the wilderness. There will even be some elite cavalry. Therefore, fleeing to the battlefield where Qin Chu and Qin Chu are fighting is equivalent to suicide. After a pause, Ding Ning panted and drank a few mouthfuls of water. Then he looked into Fu Su's eyes and said seriously, "You saw your father's choice. You should know that he does not care how many cultivators and soldiers die, as long as he can kill me." Thinking of Yuan Wu's words, Fu Su suddenly grew silent. Many breaths later, he looked up and looked firmly at Ding Ning. He said, "If it was me, I would not accept such a compromise. In reality, if you had not restrained me, I would have killed myself." "I know," Ding Ning said. Fu Su grew furious and said, "So you purposefully forced my father to say such words?" Ding Ning looked calmly at him and said, "But that was his choice. At least you heard his choice. You can imagine, if you were in another position and faced such a choice, you would not choose to sacrifice your son." Fu Su was still furious, his chest rising and falling violently, but he instinctively felt that he could not refute this. "In reality, are you not curious if you were his son?" Ding Ning looked at him and said, "He made the choice to sacrifice you because his confidence is wavering. He is not sure if you were his son." Fu Su's body froze for a moment. Then he turned his head and said coldly, "You cannot escape. We still have a chance." Ding Ning started to slowly adjust his breathing. He felt the barely discernible burning energy in his body and said, "This kind of Realm 8 power imprint will completely disappear in half a month. He will not be able to sense it." Fusu was usually gentle and kind, but right now his temper was exceptionally violent. He gritted his teeth and looked up at the dark sky. He said, "No matter if you are that person's heir or have been reborn, you should know that some people in my palace are many times faster than the fastest cavalry in the world." The beast tamers of Jiaodong Commandery. Ding Ning understood his meaning. He narrowed his eyes slightly and seemed to see some black shadows in the distant night. "But we still have a chance because Yuan Wu does not dare to chase." Fu Su was furious again. He opened his mouth to shout, but Ding Ning continued. "Because he fears death. He used Realm 8 power to fight us. In this world, the Chu cultivators in the distance know of his personal expedition and his existence. For the Chu people or the cultivators of other dynasties, killing him is their only goal. He is also seriously wounded, so he will not dare to take the risk to chase us personally." Ding Ning slowly continued. "Before he was seriously wounded, no one in the world could kill him. But now it is different. Many people can pose a fatal threat to him. Even if the one in charge is Yi Shao or Zheng Xiu and some people from the Marquisate establishment, as long as he does not come personally, we have a chance to escape. Half a month is not short. Even if you flee for your life, the general area is under control." Fu Su took a few deep breaths and tried to calm himself. He said in a cold voice, "Half a month is enough for the cultivators of other dynasties to receive the news and come here. The world knows that the 9-Death Silkworm is here, and even suspects that you are that person's rebirth. I do not know how many people will come to kill you or try to get those methods from you. This is what I am truly worried about." Ding Ning lowered his head slightly, looked at the stream, and responded softly. In a person's life, no matter how strong they were, no matter how wise they were, there were always some things that could not be predicted. He had never expected that Yuan Wu would publicly guess that he was Wang Jingming's rebirth in battle. This would cause an astounding change. What he truly worried about was not himself, but the fates of many people related to him. Chapter 611. What would happen in Chongling? What would happen after the other dynasties learned of the 9-Death Silkworm's existence and heard the Yuan Wu Emperor's guesses? This was what Ding Ning was truly worried about. This did not just concern his life and death, but also the lives of many people related to him. What are those? When it was truly night, Zhang Sun Qinxue opened her eyes and looked towards the distant sky with a watery gaze. There were many shadows in the calm night sky. Those shadows were moving very realistically, causing ripples to appear in her heart. "Night, demon ape?" Ding Ning gripped her hands. Her hands were soft but cold, a kind of monstrous ape with wings. It eats flesh and rotting things, and has a violent personality. The people of the island countries usually call these beasts yiksha. Hearing the faint sounds in the distant night sky, Ding Ning slowly explained. The reason the Zheng family was able to dominate Jiaodong Commandery was because they had some methods to control powerful sea beasts. Some of the deep-sea beasts were used by them, and were more of a threat to the fleets than Realm 7 Grandmasters. But the strongest sea beasts usually cannot leave the sea. The only ones that can fly and fight for a long time far away from the sea should be this kind of night demon ape. "There are too many," Zhang Sun Qinxue said quietly. She had heard of this kind of beasts. Their skin was thick and hard to injure with arrows, and they were extremely agile. While this kind of beasts that were a headache for low-level cultivators were nothing to her, it was different now. The Donghu monk, and she had used too much energy, and the 9 Hell King sword could only be considered a useless sword now. From a certain point of view, her many years of hard work on this life-bond sword in Chongling had all been for naught. Even though her cultivation, methods, and sword manuals were far above ordinary Realm 7 Grandmasters, she had lost the power of the 9 Hell King sword. She was wounded and had not recovered. She may have a difficult time winning against an ordinary Realm 7, or she may not win at all. There are too many of them. She did not know if they would use up her and the Donghu monk's power, and would entangle them, so they could not continue to flee. When grandmasters accompanied these beasts, it was very difficult for them to survive. Feeling the trembling of her fingers, Ding Ning gently but tightened his grip. With a voice only the two of them could hear, he said softly, "If I really die here with you, I am not afraid, nor do I have too many regrets. My biggest regret is that I didn't choose to be with you." Zhang Sun Qinxue understood his intentions. She was no longer afraid and no longer felt helpless. She only had a trace of inexplicable joy as she gently nodded. This was an emotion that no one else could understand. If they were to die tonight, then they could peacefully walk towards death together. Ding Ning breathed in the faint fragrance coming off her body. Looking at the black shadows growing clearer in the night sky, he slowly said, "It is not hopeless. Yuan Wu has not come yet. This means that my speculations are correct. He is very afraid of death. As long as he doesn't come, we still have a chance. That's because it's impossible for so many night demon apes to hide their tracks. Actually, I am especially worried about Yi Xiao." Ding Ning looked at her dazzling face and said, "A person like him who lives only for revenge is more terrifying than Zheng Xiu. Both Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu fear death and consider their own safety and benefits. But he is different. He will not care about benefits and will pay any price." Fu Su also looked up at the night sky. While he was very tired, he had not slept, not even a light nap. Zhang Sun Qinxue had been using a method to change her appearance, and Ding Ning had been wearing a black cloth. So he could not connect Ding Ning with the wine shop youth and falling parasol. Also, everyone had told him that his friend was dead. But inexplicably, looking at Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue talking calmly, he felt it was increasingly familiar. Explosive sounds began to resound in the sky. The overwhelming number of night demon apes had arrived. This was the first time he had seen such beasts from the islands of Jiaodong Commandery. They were about the same height as an adult man, but the wings on their backs were more than 10 feet wide. They were like apes, but they did not have any hair on their bodies. Their bodies were slightly hunched, and their heads were like apes, but their mouths had long, exposed fangs. The most soul-stirring thing was that at night, this demonic beast's eyes were blood red, just like the legendary demonic beasts. The entire night sky seemed to be occupied by these densely packed demonic beasts. The sound of their flapping wings caused his eardrums to buzz. Previously, he had heard some of the conversation between Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue, but he had remained silent. Only now did he look at Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue next to him. He said, "There are too many of them. You spent a lot of effort to capture me, but I seem to be of no use to you." There was faint disdain in his tone. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "Now, you will know what use you have." Fu Su did not have time to respond, because there were even more explosive explosions in the sky. The air above had turned into boiling porridge, and countless shadows had already rushed down. The night demon apes that were the first to approach had already begun to attack. Zhang Sun Qinxue did not even stand up. She coldly swung her sword. The Nine Hell King's sword had become an empty sword nucleus. But even if it did not have much energy, the sword nucleus that could withstand the extreme coldness of hell was still extremely sharp. With soft sounds, multiple night demon apes were easily cut in half by the clear and transparent sword light. In front of the Nine Hell King's sword, their tough skin, which even arrows could not penetrate, was no different from a fragile piece of paper. However, due to the lack of sufficient cold, the blood in their bodies gushed out crazily, instantly filling the entire world with the smell of blood. The smell of blood had a natural stimulating effect on these demonic beasts. Countless violent roars rang out, covering up some of the subtle sounds. A thin red flying sword came from the sky, hidden in the shattered flesh, and silently attacked Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue. At this time, the Donghu monk was still motionless, sitting like a statue, as though he did not sense the danger. Ding Ning casually reached out with a hand. "Now, you will know what use you have." His words were still echoing in Fu Su's ears, and then Fu Su felt like he was being lifted up like a shield. Ding Ning held his body and faced that flying sword. His timing was perfect. That flying sword was just a few feet away from him and Zhang Sun Qinxue. But in the space, Fu Su suddenly appeared. The one who used this flying sword was a grandmaster. He held the claw of a night demon ape with one hand, silently stopping in the air. At this time, sensing Fu Su in front of his flying sword, his breathing suddenly stopped. His flying sword that had started to accelerate suddenly froze and came to a stop. Yuan Wu could ignore Fu Su's life, but he could not, especially not kill Fu Su with his own hands. Just as he forcefully controlled his flying sword and the true essence in his body surged, he felt a trace of coldness from the back of his heart. A fatal fear spread through his body. When he lowered his head, he only saw that a broken sword had already pierced through his chest. Fine white flowers flashed on this remnant sword, and then it was covered in his blood. This Grandmaster's body fell from the sky and smashed hard into the stream in front of Ding Ning and Fu Su. Before this, the flying sword he controlled had lost its life and fallen at Ding Ning's feet. "You shameless!" Fu Su was stunned. In the next breath, he finally understood what had happened and shouted furiously. Chapter 612. Other than a battle where the weak wins against the strong, any other battle is bullying the weak and shameless. Ding Ning said. Blood sprayed on his body, but he did not seem to detect it and looked calmly at the night sky. Looking at his expression, no one would have thought that just now, a Realm 7 Grandmaster would die to such a simple sneak attack. Fu Su was very uncomfortable, but he could not speak. Ding Ning's words were very reasonable. There were too many night demon apes, and they filled the sky. Adding on the fact that there was a Realm 7 Grandmaster hiding among them, this kind of battle was not fair to begin with, and the Realm 7 Grandmaster had attacked first. The night demon apes circled angrily and continued to charge. They gathered in the space of dozens of feet and grew denser. They formed a black tornado around Ding Ning, Zhang Sun Qinxue, and the others. The black tornado was filled with red eyes and white fangs. Zhang Sun Qinshue's movements were steady and simple. She used her vital energy to the extreme. Each time she swung her sword, she would create dozens of transparent and pure sword energies that broke through the air and cut apart the night demon apes that were charging down. These black tornadoes circled around her, Ding Ning and the others, but they could not truly pose a threat. Only waves of blood formed from shattered flesh flowed in the air like red ribbons. The center of the tornado was filled with an unpleasant stench. The air was sucked upwards, and Ding Ning and the others found it difficult to breathe. But at this time, a cool breeze came. The black tornado swayed outwards and expanded slightly. A cultivator in indigo robes floated down. Yan Jing of Chongtian Sword School would like to ask Mr. for a fight. If I win, please let the Imperial Sun leave. This was clearly a Realm 7 Grandmaster. His hair was disheveled, and his clothing unkempt, but his eyes were bright. He bowed seriously. His humble figure appeared strange, but respectful in the scene of countless night demon apes circling around him. When he said such words, large amounts of energy surged out of his body, not turning into killing intent, but pure release. The powerful aura on his body gradually decreased. This was not a true fall in cultivation, but by releasing the vital energy and primal energies of the universe in his body, he lowered his vital energy to Realm 6. This Grandmaster's tone was extremely humble, and he used the word beg. But the truth was so. If Ding Ning was that person reborn, no one in the world could be proud in front of him. They were both Realm 6. Even if Ding Ning was seriously injured, just from the perfect sword essence he had shown, this cultivator from Chongtian Sword School had a slim chance of victory. But for this cultivator, this was a chance for Fu Su to leave safely. Looking at this humble Grandmaster, Ding Ning nodded in greeting. He did not say anything else, just one word. Yes. This simple word contained a presence that Realm 7s could not reach. This cultivator from Chongtian Sword School suddenly grew excited. He took a deep breath, and a life bond sword energy formed in front of his chest. A life-bond sword that looked like a yellow bamboo blade appeared in his hand. He held it across his chest and said, "Please." Hiss. There was a cracking sound. His life-bond sword disappeared from his hand. Dozens of yellow bolts of lightning suddenly shot out of the space between him and Ding Ning. The ends of the lightning even exploded. It appeared that this was hard to defend against. While his attitude was extremely humble, he did not show any mercy when he attacked, even surpassing his usual limits. Ding Ning lowered his body. The rough body of the great punishment sword appeared in his hand, and he thrust it from the bottom up. There was a muffled bang, as if a bamboo pole had struck a rock at the bottom of the water. The yellow lightning all collapsed. The life-bond sword flew out at an angle, piercing through the chest of a night demon ape that could not dodge in time, and then flew back into the night. This grandmaster from Chongtian Sword School turned into a stream of light and retreated. His eyes were filled with shock and disbelief as his left hand gripped his right wrist. His right wrist had been broken. The power that had hit his right arm was still going deep into his body and injuring his organs. He recognized Ding Ning's attack just now. This was the wind-raising sword of his Chongtian Sword School. This was the sword move of his school. Its exquisiteness could not compare to the secret sword he was using just now. But the other had used such a simple sword move of his school to defeat his sword move in an instant and hit his sword-wielding wrist. Ding Ning put away his sword and gently swallowed the blood that surged to his throat. Fu Su's lips trembled slightly and his face was snow-white. He was not disappointed because he could not escape, but he could sense what level Ding Ning's sword represented. In the sky, there were many grandmasters who could use these night demon apes to come and not be attacked by them. They were Empress Zheng Xiu's subordinates. Some of them came directly from Jiaodong Commandery and were the masters of these night demon apes. But when they saw Yan Jing of Chongtian Sword School defeated by Ding Ning in one blow, these grandmasters maintained their silence and did not immediately join the battle. The Donghu monk had not opened his eyes. All of them added together may not be a match for Zhangsun Qinxue, Ding Ning, and the Donghu monk. They needed to use these night demon apes to consume more of the power of the Donghu monk and the eldest miss of the Gongsun family. In the night, Sima Qiuo lay in a warm carriage, soft mattress piled around him. A medical officer was carefully taking care of him. The carriage he was in was retreating towards the Yin Mountain. Most of the Qin dynasty armies were retreating in an orderly manner. Under the mad pursuit of the Chu dynasty army, there would naturally be troops left behind on this land. At the place where the battle to lure Ding Ning and the others had occurred, the black-robed Yishao was still at the top of the hill. He looked in the direction that the night demon ape was flying in, and deep within his eyes, a flame of hatred burned. This flame seemed to be burning his own soul, and if he didn't go in that direction, his body would be burned to ashes. But he was still waiting. Supreme One. In the darkness, cultivators rushed behind him one after another, bowed, and then waited with him. These cultivators all carried heavy sword boxes on their backs. These sword boxes were used to store many swords. In order to prevent the swords from colliding with each other and causing damage, there were special wooden compartments inside, and the swords were fixed so they could not move. A large number of swords had to be transported. These swords were usually the standard swords used by the military, and these sword boxes were usually used by the military. But at this time, the sword boxes on the backs of these cultivators gave off all kinds of sounds. There were sword energies inside that cried out in praise or cheered in joy. Chapter 613. Multiple grandmasters stopped in the air and looked silently at the night demon apes spinning into black tornadoes below. Their perception had always been focused on the Donghu monk. This monk from Donghu was the only person in the world who could face the Yuanwu emperor head-on. While he was meditating with his eyes closed, if they attacked, this Donghu monk still had the power to kill them when he opened his eyes. It took countless years of hard work to become a grandmaster. Even though they were not rare in the few great wars in human history, Grandmasters themselves cherished their lives very much. If there was no reason for them to die, no one would take the risk easily. As time passed, the confusion in their eyes when they looked at the old monk grew stronger and stronger. The night demon ape could be called a demonic beast because it was much stronger than the ferocious beasts that people were familiar with. Their attacks were as fast as lightning, and their flying posture was also extremely strange. They could even dodge and quickly change their direction in an extremely small space. Seeing Zhang Sun Qinshuai indifferently attack, she seemed to easily kill these beasts, but as Realm 7 cultivators, they knew this was just an appearance. They could even feel, as though they were there, that every strand of flesh in Zhang Sun Qinshuai's arm became sore, painful, and stiff. Zhang Sun Qinshuai's face was very pale. She crushed a pill bottle with her left hand and swallowed a milky white pill into her stomach. A fresh presence quickly spread from her abdomen and spread through her entire body. This aura caused the heartbeats of the Grandmasters who were waiting above to speed up a little. This was the truth-returning pill. It was a kind of elixir made from dozens of extremely precious elixirs. Among them, more than 10 elixirs came from overseas, and several of them had already gone extinct. This kind of pill had astounding effects on replenishing energy and healing wounds for cultivators. Even decades ago, there were only a few pills in Chongling, and they belonged to the imperial family and the strongest old nobility. The other was the legendary eldest miss of the Gongsun family. It was not surprising that she had such an immortal-level pill, but if she was forced to use such a pill, it meant that she had been squeezed to the limit. Either flee or attack. At this time, this Donghu monk was still meditating with his eyes closed. Then what kind of chance was he waiting for? The Grandmasters were even more puzzled. Fu Su's face was paler than Zhang Sun Qinshuai. One was due to his injuries, and the other was that this simple and repeated bloody killing made him feel like vomiting and could not breathe smoothly. The torn flesh and limbs of the night demon apes gradually piled up, and the sticky blood soaked through his shoes. Later, he unconsciously stood on the limbs of the night demon apes, and these relatively intact limbs piled up under him, Ding Ning and the others. The Donghu monk seemed to know nothing of the outside world. These broken limbs piled up to his waist and slowly buried him. You should have never been to Jiaodong Commandery. What the Grandmasters could not understand was that in a situation like this, where more people or armies could come to kill him at any time, Ding Ning still maintained his calm. At this time, Ding Ning looked at Fu Su, who was paler than Zhang Sun Qinshuai, and asked calmly, "So you do not know much about Jiaodong Commanderies?" Fu Su suppressed his feeling of disgust and said, "What do you mean? There are too many night demon apes. I originally thought that it was not simple to have 1/3 of the night demon ape population." Ding Ning said simply, "The night demon apes can only live on some unique islands overseas. Jiaodong Commandery raises the night demon apes with medicine to make them addicted, but usually these night demon apes live on those islands. Even more importantly, these night demon apes do not eat food from the sea. Since ancient times, their favorite food is the natives of the islands and the fishermen on the sea." After a pause, Ding Ning looked at Fu Su, who seemed to think of something, and said, "After the Qin dynasty, or rather, Jiaodong Commandery purged the islands several times. The population is not many. Especially when most of the island countries have become vassals of Jiaodong Commandery, they cannot become the food of the night demon apes. Do not say it so tactfully. One of the reasons why Zhengxiu is called cold is because Jiaodong Commandery often sends prisoners to feed the sea beasts." As Zhang Sun Qinshuai attacked, she said coldly and with slight disdain, "But how can the prisoners of Jiaodong Commandery be enough to feed so many night demon apes?" Fu Su took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and said, "Why should I believe your words?" Ding Ning smiled faintly and did not say anything. His life bond sword energy flowed out of his hand. The ancient great punishment sword that even the night demon apes were afraid of appeared in his hand. Then he placed the sword on Fu Su's white neck in an even more natural manner. The rippling sword energy on the sword cut faint lines of blood on Fu Su's skin. Fu Su's breathing suddenly stopped. He looked at Ding Ning. What do you want to do? The Grandmasters in the sky also felt a chill run down their spines as their mental states fluctuated. Since these night demon apes were sent by your mother, then I want to see her intentions. Killing the enemy or the life of her son, which is more important? Ding Ning looked up and said coldly and expressionlessly, "Let these night demon apes leave, otherwise I will kill him." You! Fu Su was so angry his entire body trembled, and he could not even curse shamelessly. Do not doubt my determination. Ding Ning still looked up and said slowly. How did she know something like this would happen? Fu Su shouted. What happens here spreads too quickly and does not have time to reach Xiangling. Even so, how can you see her intentions? If some matters are more important than the battle itself, the speed at which news spreads will surpass your imagination. Ding Ning said calmly. Even more importantly, her subordinates' reactions can often reveal her intentions. Their guesses about her intentions can represent many things. Flames of anger flashed in the eyes of the Grandmasters in the sky. Are you really that person? A Grandmaster could not help but shout. I do not believe that person would use such despicable means. Hearing this, Ding Ning smiled disdainfully. Do you really believe that a person can be reborn after death? The Grandmasters stilled at the same time. After a moment of silence, the Grandmaster who had spoken said, But since the Holy One has said so today, I fear that most cultivators in the world will think that you are that person's rebirth. Your words and actions represent that person and the Bazinkindo ground. If your actions are shameless and despicable, will many people still follow you and the Bazinkindo ground like in the past? Everyone has their own eyes. Ding Ning said calmly. If you say shameless and despicable, maybe people will think you are smart. You should know that when that person died in Xiangling, many people felt that he was very stupid and idiotic. The Grandmasters sank into silence. They had no words to argue. Ding Ning did not look in their direction and looked at his sword. Beads of blood started to appear on his sword. Several angry howls resounded in the air. The group of night demon apes suddenly scattered in fear, like countless puffs of black smoke burning in the air. I just do not understand. Since you use such shameless means, why did you not use it earlier, and wait until now to use it? Fu Su felt threads of pain on his neck and shouted furiously as he looked at Ding Ning's eyes. Chapter 614. Ding Ning looked back into his eyes and said, Other than me, no one knows the true secret of the 9-death silkworm, not even Yuan Wu. Yet he publicly concluded that I was that person's rebirth in front of so many people. He did not just need to find a reason to kill me in that situation. He also wanted to see what kind of change would occur and how many people would stand on his side, and how many would stand on my side. For him, the forces that grow in darkness are like parasitic vines that attach themselves to trees. For his empire and his ambitions, it is naturally much better for them to be exposed and uprooted rather than slowly and freely growing. After a pause, Ding Ning ignored the anger and impatience in Fu Su's eyes and said slowly, But even if the news itself is shocking enough, even if he consciously spread the news, regardless of whether it is the people who want to kill me or the people who want to save me, it will still take some time for them to know. He needs time, and I also need time to let people know where I am. Fu Su was stunned and then understood. He sneered. You need time to let people detect the movements of these night demon apes and where they passed, so the people who want to save you can find you. A very good idea. But have you ever thought, in order to save you, many people will die? Sacrificing other people's lives so you can live, is this the so-called kindness and justice of the Bazinkindo ground? Do not be so excited. Ding Ning slowly put away his sword and said calmly, Our situation is equivalent to waiting for death at the Qinshu border. Even if I do not do anything, with Yuan Wu's help, the news will quickly spread. Those people will still do what they should do. What I could do is make them more efficient and maybe reduce the danger. If many people die on this path, then all I can do is to make their deaths as worthwhile as possible. Fu Su's chest rose and fell violently. He still felt that Ding Ning's words were shameless, but in terms of bickering, he felt that he could not compare to this person in front of him. I believe some of the things you said now. Things like coming back from the dead are too uncertain. You are not similar to Wang Jingming at all. He took a few deep breaths and said viciously, back then, many people thought that Wang Jingming was stupid because they thought that if Wang Jingming endured for a few more years, he would be able to get revenge when he reached Realm 8. But he had fought his way into Chongling for the lives of some people. He would rather die than have others die for him. Therefore, even though the Bazin Kendo ground was destroyed, it still won the respect of the world. Let me correct a few of your statements. Ding Ning said seriously and sternly. The Bazin Kendo ground did not just win the respect of the world alone. He also fought his way into Chongling because he was forced by the situation. If there were enough people like you in exchange, and Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu could accept the exchange, he would not have entered Chongling to die. Some things can threaten him, but not Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu. The conditions are not equal at all. Then didn't you want to see my mother's intentions, to see if she cares about my life and death? Do you see it now? Fu Su wiped away the blood that flowed to his collar and stuck to it. He pointed angrily at the sky and asked Ding Ning. I also do not want you to die. Ding Ning said, I hope that her attitude towards you will always be like this, especially when the news from Yuanwu reaches her ears. Fu Su chose to shut up. He felt that there was no meaning in arguing with such an annoying person. Also, he could not win. You are very kind. I hope that you will always be like this. But Ding Ning did not want to stop here. He slowly said, but kindness does not mean stupidity. You have to be completely blinded by some things. Previously, when I told you about her cruelty in Jiaodong Commandery and her helpless choice back then, I was reminding you that my guess is that you may have been abandoned by her. Some beautiful things are not as beautiful as you think. If you really want to be the emperor of the Qin dynasty in the future, then you cannot look at things as simply as you do now. Fu Su laughed in anger. You are teaching me? You are using my life as a threat, and you want to teach me? I am just asking you to accompany us on this journey. Ding Ning looked calmly at his face and said softly, the greatest possibility is that we will die, but you will live in the end. Or, we will walk this journey together. If we live, you will naturally live. Regardless of the possibility, I hope that the path we have walked will have some effect on your future. Ding Ning looked at the stunned Fu Su and said. Fu Su breathed heavily, not knowing what he was feeling. Silence fell again. Actually, there is an important question that you did not ask. Because in your view, this question is an insult to Zheng Xiu. Ding Ning looked away from him and at the night sky where many night demon apes were flying. He said softly, you do not care if you are Yuanwu's son? Fu Su's body immediately froze. When Ding Ning said the first half of the sentence, he already knew what Ding Ning really wanted to say. This was the true terror deep in his heart. If that possibility was true, then that was something he could not face. Ding Ning knew how he felt right now. He did not wait for Fu Su to speak and said softly, of course you are Yuanwu's son, and not that person's son. But the key is, even if Zheng Xiu knows, Yuanwu will not believe it. His cultivation has reached Realm 8. No matter if it is perception or touch of energy, it is not something ordinary grandmasters can imagine. Ding Ning looked at Fu Su, whose lips were turning blue. He said slowly and clearly, he can immediately sense my true bone age and know that there was at least 2 to 3 years between my birth and that person's death. But he still deduced that I am not that person's heir, and most likely that person's rebirth. Since he believes that there is such a possibility, then he naturally believes that Zheng Xiu has some way to hide her pregnancy. Even more importantly, he does not believe Zheng Xiu and does not completely understand her secrets. If my father really suspects me, is that not because of your shameless methods? Fu Su's body started to tremble. If there is true trust, then any words are useless. Ding Ning glanced at Zhang Sun Qinxue and then said, you saw Yuanwu's reaction before, and heard it with your own ears. Maybe to him, you and Zhengxiu are the stains of his life. His glorious throne will not allow such filth to exist, even if it would only lead to rumors and gossip. He can tolerate Zhengxiu because of the existence of an enemy like me. Fu Su could not speak. There were countless words in his heart that he wanted to refute, but he couldn't utter a single word. With a pop, he vomited a mouthful of blood. Yuanwu and Zhengxiu are my enemies, but you are not my enemy. Ding Ning still did not look at him and said sincerely, if you want to live, maybe you should help me. Chapter 615. My body, hair, and skin were given to me by my parents. Fu Su did not think about any of the truths Ding Ning said. He bowed his head and said, if my death can bury an enemy like you that they worry about, then I am willing to die. Ding Ning did not say anything else. His mood was very calm. From a certain point of view, he was even slightly comforted because he had not misjudged Fu Su. This night's darkness seemed exceptionally long. The black shadows of the night demon apes moved restlessly in the nearby sky, their red eyes like ghost fire in the darkness. As time passed, the Donghu monk still did not open his eyes. But these night demon apes in the sky first sensed a strange presence. From the suppressed restlessness of waiting and bloodthirstiness to a restlessness of facing the unknown terror. In facing danger and minute changes in primal energies of the universe, most beasts had instinctive senses that surpassed powerful cultivators. The abnormality of these beasts naturally alarmed the grandmasters who had been waiting. These grandmasters could not catch where this change in primal energies of the universe came from. But in the next few breaths, they were certain that this incomprehensible change in energy came from the Donghu monk who still had his eyes closed. An enormous sound sounded in the sky. That was an astonishing flow of yuan qi, and it vibrated along with their intensely fluctuating state of mind. These grandmasters finally understood what Ding Ning had been waiting for by staying here. Even Zhongsun Qinxue only reacted now. As the enormous sound sounded in the sky, she looked in shock at the Donghu monk next to her and asked Ding Ning, he is not healing, but having a breakthrough? Breakthrough is the best method of healing. Ding Ning looked at her and said, at this time, we finally have some chance of survival. For a Realm 7 Grandmaster, Realm 8 was a mysterious and unfathomable domain. Zhongsun Qinxue believed that even Ding Ning had only been guessing before and was only certain now. Because of the battle with the Yuanwu Emperor, this old monk who had touched the edge of Realm 8 finally grasped the chance to have a breakthrough. There were precedents of a breakthrough in a life and death situation in battle, but in the history of the cultivation world, there were no precedents of a Realm 7 entering Realm 8 in battle. The Donghu monk showed signs of entering Realm 8, and there were energy changes that Realm 7s could not understand in this part of the world. There might be a second cultivator in the world who entered Realm 8, and this Realm 8 cultivator would be the attendant guarding Ding Ning. But at this time, Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue did not have any warmth or ease. No one could predict how long it would take for him to have a breakthrough, and the many grandmasters waiting would not allow him to have a breakthrough. The majestic sound in the sky, which was purely caused by the movement of the qi of heaven and earth, instantly turned into all kinds of sharp sounds of cutting through the air, and then turned into violent killing intent. Between Fu Su's life and whether to wait and create a Realm 8 enemy of the Qin dynasty, these many grandmasters made the same choice at the same time. Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue exchanged a deep look and then looked up at the sky. They knew that this might be their last time. Zhongsun Qinxue waved her hand and sent out a cold sword light. The sword essence contained in this cold sword light could not help but make people think of the pool of cold water in a lonely courtyard, or the winter that always bloomed beside the pool after winter. But no one ever stopped in front of this winter. This sword essence was waiting. A person guarding and waiting alone. In the many years in Chongling, Zhongsun Qinxue did not know Ding Ning's true identity. She had the deepest love and also the deepest hate. She was waiting for a chance to take revenge, and also buried herself, waiting for a person who would never return. This was the sword essence she had formed in more than a decade, the strongest sword she had comprehended in these years in Chongling. At such a moment, she did not hesitate to slash out with her sword. Multiple gasps of disbelief and a shocked howl sounded at the same time. This cold sword light easily cut through the sword barrier that was like an enormous boat and cut a grandmaster in half at the waist. But at the same time, two sword essences fell like heavenly punishment. One like a brilliant sunset fell towards the Donghu monk. One like a hazy mist fell towards Zhongsun Qinxue. Waves of blood rose in Ding Ning's throat, and a layer of bitterness appeared on his face. His right hand moved slightly. Countless sword threads carried the vital energy that furiously surged out of his body and bloomed on his hand like fireworks. The dancing sword threads stretched out like dancing zither strings, and fine white flowers bloomed in the air. These flowers passed through the mist and destroyed the energy rules of this sword. There were hissing sounds. This violent sword did not have much power left when it came close to Zhongsun Qinxue. Blood started to flow from Ding Ning's lips. No blood flowed out of his wounds, but the tearing of his flesh deepened. The world in front of him grew hazy, and his consciousness blurred. He was close to his limit. Between the two sword lights that were attacking the Donghu monk and Zhongsun Qinxue, he chose to block the sword that was attacking Zhongsun Qinxue. This was not because of closeness, but because he knew that Zhongsun Qinxue could not block this sword. But the old monk who was in the midst of his breakthrough had a thread of hope that he could block this attack. The air around the Donghu monk suddenly folded in layers, like a piece of crystal that was about to crack. This was clearly in the world of perception. This old monk had detected the arrival of killing intent and started to react. But this reaction was almost instinctive. The Donghu monk did not seem to be able to escape from the moment of his breakthrough and then block this sword. Ding Ning's heart fell to the bottom. Within a radius of 100 zhong, even the old monk himself was unable to block this sword. Then who else in this world could possibly block this sword? The death of the Donghu monk was equal to the death of him and Zhongsun Qinxue. Ding Ning did not have time to say anything or do anything. He instinctively wanted to hold Zhongsun Qinxue's hand. At this time, a sword light rose from the distant darkness, from the plains. With a presence that Ding Ning was familiar with, it fell towards the Donghu monk. A shocked and furious voice sounded in the sky again. When this exclamation sounded, the two sword lights had already collided. With a cracking sound, the two sword lights collided with each other. It was as if a crisp icicle had been broken. That sword light had started at least 1,000 feet from here, but the sword light within 100 feet was stopped by the sword light 1,000 feet away. Only now did Ding Ning recover his breathing. He knew who had come. There was only one person in the world who could be so fast. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.